Welcome to Season 2. This is a more interesting season, as the location changes from my dorm room to my room, and also back to my dorm room for my second year of university. What I had wanted to do was sort of create my own lore and sort of my own mini skits to go along with these reviews, but to make a long story short, I didn't get to it. And as a result of that, a lot of the reviews of these movies ended up getting pushed back. In fact, most of these reviews came out when the respective movies were already wrapping up their theatrical runs or were already sitting on the Blu-ray shelf. And such begins the tradition, or whatever you want to call it, of Canadian movie buff reviews always being a bit behind the curve. Of course, there are a number of times where I have pushed a review out early, even if it's not in chronological order, but I did my best to play catch-up, and it didn't take too long before my reviews actually covered movies that were still in theaters. Even though my reviews of movies coming out way after they've left theaters is still a running theme of this channel and the series too. The original run for this season was from January 2017 to February 2018. This season's premiere, Return of Xander Cage, remains the most viewed episode to this day, a fact that I'm hoping to change in the near future. As I mentioned in the last video, no major edits have been made other than cutting out the intros and the outros and balancing out the audio. If you want to watch these episodes in all their glory, check out the Season 2 playlist. Enjoy! So this is the third movie in an action franchise that Vin Diesel starred in about 15 years ago, and then he got replaced by Ice Cube, but now he's back. The story goes is that there's this device called Pandora's Box, and it can hack into any satellite. This group of extreme athletes / martial artists steal it, and so the NSA calls in Xander Cage to come bring it back. So yeah, a real original story. I have not seen the previous two XXX movies, but if they're anything like this, then I may never see them. Before I make it rain fire on this mess of film, let me say a few nice things about it. For starters, the stunts are pretty cool. In fact, I was generally curious about how they pulled some of these off. While the action sequences are over the top, you can definitely see the entertainment value. It's one of those things where you just turn off your brain and just enjoy the moment. Also, Donnie Yen, the blind monk from Rogue One, is an amazing martial artist. His fighting style is so fast and furious that no wonder he got cast in this movie. It matches the tone perfectly. Speaking of the cast, it's very diverse. Now, having actors of different ethnicity doesn't make or break how good a movie is going to be, but in this case, it works in their favor. And you could definitely tell they were having fun while making this movie. And by the way, when I say the actors looked like they were having fun, I was talking about the ones that were actually doing anything. Everybody else on the side, not so much. Said side characters include Toni Collette, who plays a secret agent in charge that you've seen in just about every other action movie. Spends a huge chunk of the movie on the sidelines and is only there to tell off the hero for doing something wrong or to blurb out exposition. Speaking of cliched characters, there's also this gadget expert who's supposed to be quirky, but I swear she delivers her lines as bland and as in your face as possible. It was this impossible combination of being super annoying or cringy as hell. If you need a perfect combination of bad acting and bad writing, then look no further than Nina Dobrev's performance in this movie. But the trend of stereotypical action characters doesn't stop there. Tony Gonzalez plays the classic army guy who doesn't trust the hero and ends up resenting every little thing said hero does. So yeah, this movie has the holy trinity of cliched action movie side characters. Now we're entering spoiler territory, so skip to this part if you don't want to hear it. But in my opinion, you'll be doing yourself a favor if you stick around. Alright, so for those of you who are going to see this because Samuel L. Jackson is in this, let me tell you what happens. He's in there in the beginning for about 5 minutes, then he gets killed off, then he shows up again at the end for the last 2 minutes in classic Nick Fury style. I'm still alive, but you're gonna have to keep that a secret. I guess since this is an action movie, you gotta include all the tropes and cliches as humanly possible. One of said tropes is the twist that the agent in charge who sent the hero on his mission was the bad guy all along. And it's not even that big of a surprise, you can see it a mile off.
I don't know why Xander Cage had to come back, but he's not getting a warm welcome. The story is nothing new, the stunts make the ones from the Fast and Furious movies look tame, the editing is more jumbled than a Transformers movie, and the actors who aren't throwing fists or shooting guns are either bland or annoying. My final thoughts on this: if you enjoyed the first two, then go nuts. But if you're looking for something with a lot more substance, then I suggest you do yourself a favor and skip it. I feel like I owe an apology. I once said that this looks like an unofficial Fast and Furious sequel, but the difference between a Fast and Furious movie and this is that they actually put effort into the FNF series. So Split is a horror thriller? It's a scary movie. What happens is that these three girls are kidnapped by this creepy guy, played by James McAvoy, and they discover that he has multiple personalities. He locks them in their basement, and so the girls try to escape. I was sold on this movie the moment I saw the trailer. I didn't even care it had M. Night Shyamalan's name attached to it, and having seen it for myself, I can say it does not disappoint. It's still early in the year, but James McAvoy deserves some recognition. Because of this guy's mentality, he has to play all the various personalities. In the end, he ends up playing multiple characters. Playing one character well takes up a lot of effort. So just imagine how much time and energy he had to put in to pull off these alternative personalities. Pin this performance on the Board Academy, you'll thank me for it later. The three actresses who play the girls also do a fantastic job, most notably Anya Taylor-Joy. She plays the quiet girl, but as we progress, we learn a bit about her backstory. And after learning her backstory, you're surprised that she's the most level-headed out of the three of them. For a quote-unquote horror movie, it's not really that scary. Let me rephrase that. There's an uneasy and creepy atmosphere that hangs over the entire movie. There's just not any jump scares, which is nice because most horror movies are just that same gimmick on repeat for 2 hours straight. Granted, there are some that do it really well, and it's quite impressive, but the majority of them don't even try. However, throughout the entire runtime, you get this uneasy feeling in the back of your neck. You're asking yourself, how much control does this guy have over his alternate personalities? Is he going to snap? Speaking of a creepy overtone, one of the personalities is a 9-year-old boy named Hedwig. He's the comic relief of the movie, and they are genuine moments of humor because he behaves exactly how you expect a 9-year-old kid to act. But then on the other side of the coin, you realize that this is one of the voices inside the head of a fully grown man. There's plenty of laughs, but they're mostly nervous laughs. There's also this interesting idea of something called the Beast. And that's the movie's big question. Is the Beast real? Is it the 24th personality, or is it just something one of the voices made up just to keep the other ones in line? It had that Lord of the Flies mentality. You didn't know whether it was fantasy or reality. Is it a legitimate threat, or is it just the product of too much imagination? This movie does have issues, I will admit that. My main problem is this. The guy has 23 personalities, but you only see 7. Shyamalan could have just written 7 instead of 23 and he would have gotten away with it. He could have just easily been like, okay, we only see 7 personalities, I'll just make that little change there and we're good. But instead, we get 16 personalities that are never seen. There's also a few moments in the movie where he goes to visit a psychologist as Barry, a teenage artist. Now that does sound interesting at first. She sees this troubled individual, she wants to help, ends up getting caught in this mystery, but for just about every scene she's in, the movie slows down. Granted, it does get interesting over time. You're storing little bits of dialogue in the back of your head in case there's a big plot twist or something. That way at the end you can go, aha, I saw that coming. In most scenes, however, she's as boring and frustrating as a trip to the local shrink. I was also a little confused as to why they showed the backstory of the quiet girl. I guess the idea was to show us how well she can handle herself in a situation like that, but all it did was make me raise my eyebrows like, what was the point of that again? After a long line of career-destroying movies, M. Night Shyamalan had to pull a miracle to get back on the right track. Right now, he's heading down Redemption Road. It's long, it's unwinding, and it won't be easy, but I think Shyamalan will one day reclaim that status he once had with The Sixth Sense. And yeah, The Visit was a solid comeback, but it left me unsure as to whether or not we can start calling him a credible director again. After this movie, I think we can start overlooking some of his shortcomings. It's a great character-based story with a mystery that you're not sure you want to have answered. By constantly keeping me on the edge of my seat, I walked out of the theater feeling entertained and found that the movie had high rewatchability. Which is great, because Split is definitely worth watching multiple times, whether it's at the theater or on Blu-ray. So Live by Night is a crime drama written, directed, and starring Ben Affleck. It's based on the book of the same name, and it tells the story of Joe Coughlin, an outlaw who becomes a notorious gangster during the Prohibition era of the 1920s. After the not-so-great year Ben Affleck had, this is a return to form for him working in front and behind the camera. Despite this, it has an all-too-familiar story and a surprisingly lack of substance. Say what you will about Affleck, but the guy really knows how to direct. Each shot of the movie is visually appealing and beautiful to look at, and this is best demonstrated through the action sequences. The amazing cinematography and the brief moments of sheer ruthlessness really add to the feeling of chaos. The ending shootout and the getaway chase are probably my favorite scenes from the entire movie. Moving on to the front of the camera, praises to the entire cast. It's one of those rare movies where there isn't a bad performance in sight, which, funny enough, has been the complaint for Ben Affleck's other 2016 movies. Now, while the story is cohesive and easy to follow, it has its fair share of problems. The first being that it had a sense of predictability to it. Common outlaw gets into a crime family, he works his way up the ranks, and it either ends with his downfall or his ultimate triumph. We've seen this type of movie before. In fact, the more I think about it, the more the structure of the plot reminds me of The Godfather. Our hero doesn't want to get caught up in the lifestyle, the loss of a loved one pushes him into it, he works his way to the top, and ends up becoming a powerful crime boss. In a nutshell, this is discount Godfather. You heard it here first, CinemaSins. Moving on to big complaint number 2, it felt a bit rushed. There are moments in the movie where it takes great leaps across unknown amounts of time through montages. It offers glimpses in what I can only assume are crucial plot points in the book, but the information feels rushed into irrelevance. It's like the movie's way of saying, we don't have enough time to show you this, but here's something that happened. Now let's move on. While there were no bad performances, there was a problem with line delivery. Because it's Boston in the 1920s, a popular city with new immigrants at the time, much of the cast was Irish, and a couple of the accents were ridiculously thick. Thick enough that they should have added subtitles at the bottom of the screen. This was a huge strike on their part. How are we supposed to understand what's going on and feel the emotional gravity of a scene if we can't understand a word of what they're saying? As a moviegoer, every little snippet of dialogue matters because you don't know how much weight it may hold. When you got potentially important dialogue, it is vital that everybody can hear it clearly. Otherwise, it gets lost and there's a knowledge gap in either the story or the character. Given the rough year, it's high time Ben Affleck got a break. He's a great actor and he's an awesome director, but this movie has me worried that he may be slipping up in the writing department. This could have been a case of rushed project. The studio wanted to put this out for Oscar season, but they didn't let Ben give it the time and care it needed. Or I could be wrong, after all, this is Ben Affleck's first time writing a movie all by himself. And based off a book for that matter. And we all know how book adaptations go. But for me, I found the screenplay boring. What was unnecessary dragged on. And what was actually interesting was haphazardly montaged through. I can't say that you should see it in theaters whether it's full price or at the cheap seats, but you should probably wait and then watch it if it's on Netflix. So gold is inspired by the 1993 mining scandal of a Calgary-based company called Bre-X, which is weird because this takes place in Reno, Nevada in 1988. 5 years before the actual event. Matthew McConaughey plays a guy named Kenny Wells who's in the prospecting business. He's fallen on hard times and is having trouble getting financial backers. That is, until he heads to Indonesia and strikes gold. Now, everybody wants to work with him. While there are some interesting moments here and there, Matthew McConaughey's performance cannot save this movie. As I just mentioned, Matthew McConaughey is fantastic in this role. You see this guy pursuing the ultimate American dream, and all it's given him is some low-key alcoholism, a smoker's mouth, and a balding head. There's a certain optimism to the character. He treats every meeting as if it was a new opportunity, even though it more often than not ends with him getting nowhere. Suddenly, he finds a gold mine in the middle of nowhere, and everybody wants to be friends with him. He's just so happy that he's attained his dream that he doesn't care about who takes notice. But this ends up being a downfall for him as lots of people try to take advantage of him. There's also a surprisingly very talented supporting cast. Edgar Ramirez, Bryce Dallas Howard, Corey Stoll, and Toby Kebbell, who is still trying to live down that fantastic trash fire. They all do great jobs. Ramirez is amazing as the geologist who becomes Wells' partner. Howard really plays well the part of the caring wife. Stoll is really convincing as the Wall Street guy that you don't really know if you should trust. And Kebbell is solid as the FBI investigator. Oh yeah, this is a finance movie, so of course the FBI are gonna be involved. These finance movies are really starting to run together. Wolf of Wall Street, War Dogs, they all have the same story structure. Guy hates his life, dreams of being rich, opportunity comes along that allows him to fulfill that dream. Some shady stuff goes down, the FBI investigate, the hero gets away scot-free and finds a more legitimate way to make money. Topped off with an ambiguous ending that you'll probably forget about by the time you get home. Honestly, it's like the guys who wrote the script watched The Wolf of Wall Street and said, we can make something just as good. John, what's the most popular metal on the stock market right now? I don't know. Gold? Perfect, write that down. We'll make it the title. Now we just need a true story to base it off of. There's the scandal that happened in Calgary in 1993. Changed it to Reno, Nevada in 1988. We'll just say it was inspired by true events. But that won't make it a proper Inspired, not based on, inspired by true events. There's a big difference. I wouldn't be surprised if that's how the writing process went. After all, this is the first time either one of them has ever written a screenplay. And it clearly shows, as the comedy is so weak that it's kind of awkward. The writing is so unsure of itself that when a joke is made, you're just sitting there like, oh, was I supposed to laugh at that? And the pace of this movie. The movie just dragged on. It was only 2 hours long, but it felt like 3. It also had a case of Return of the King ending syndrome. That's a string of 7 moments where you think that's when they're going to end the movie, but instead they pull out another 2 minutes of screen time. And I had to go to the bathroom really bad about 2/3 of the way through it. So the last 15 minutes was agony. Well, looks like April Fool's came early this year, and this time it lasted a whole month. Just like Live by Night and Patriots Day, Gold is a movie that tried way too hard to get awards attention and ended up falling apart in its own ego. The comedy was non-existent, the story structure was predictable, the pace was slow and boring, and it had nothing to do with the true events it was inspired by. Seriously, they could have said that this was an original story and they probably would have gotten away with it. Like the investors at the beginning of this movie, you shouldn't be spending your money on it. In fact, you should do yourself a favor and wait to see it if it's on Netflix. Following up on where we left off, former hitman John Wick, played by Keanu Reeves, tries to leave his line of work for good, but just when he thinks he's out, they pull him right back in. And as if getting his house blown up wasn't enough, a bounty has been placed on his head and assassins from all over the world are hunting him down. It's a rare treat when a sleeper hit gets a follow-up, and it's even rarer for the sequel to be so well done. Case in point, this movie, which is as entertaining and action-packed as the original. Right off the bat, the action is amazing. The fight sequences are very well choreographed with very few jump cuts and close-ups. And while it is more brutal than the first, it never quite reaches that level of being too over the top. A welcome change, as most fight sequences are extreme spectacles with so many jump cuts that you're confused as to what is going on. I'm looking at you, Civil War. Once again, Keanu Reeves is amazing as John Wick. It's almost as if the character was tailor-made for him. His stern-faced approach and lack of empathy comes in handy because when he has to put that war face on, it has a natural fit. Not once did I look at his expression in the fight scene and think that it was too cartoony. Along with the good acting and action, the movie also did a great job expanding the lore. We learned new information about John and more about the Hitman underworld and the rules that come with it. Not to mention the new cast members, which are welcomed with open arms. The additions of Common and Ruby Rose not only gave us some new interesting characters, but also opened a few pages in the franchise's lore. And you may have heard this in the news already, but they are already going ahead with a 3rd installment. Luckily for us, the movie ends on a note that allows room for said sequel to happen. I won't spoil it here, but it raises the stakes to a whole new level. I know that sounded really cliche, but trust me, it does. There's a moment of plasticity, which is pulled off flawlessly by Keanu Reeves. How plastic is it? We're talking levels. But it doesn't last too long, and before you know it, we're right back in the action again. Besides, that trait has followed Keanu his entire career, so it's bound to show up even in the best of performances. When all was said and done, Chapter 2 is everything a good sequel should be. It expanded on the lore, it gave us a more complex story, it taught us something new about the hero, it had quality action sequences, and it leaves the door open for a 3rd movie without necessarily feeling like a build-up to one. When comparing it to the original, Chapter 2 is just as, if not more, entertaining. Here's hoping that it does better at the box office than the first. It's this year's dose of Valentine's Day R-rated action, and it is a Total Incrediblast! This is is Hugh Jackman's ninth and final performance as the titular character and the second Wolverine movie to be directed by James Mangold. Said in 2029, mutants are all but extinct. Wolverine and Charles Xavier are living off the grid and keeping a low profile. And then an 11-year-old girl winds up in their care with powers similar to that to Logan's. Now dogged by the military, her last hope of safety is a haven that is nothing but a rumor. And like always, Logan's the best man for the job. There's a lot of buzz surrounding this movie at its world premiere. They were saying things like, oh, it's going to win Best Picture, it's the best superhero movie since The Dark Knight. Now that I've seen the movie for myself, I can say that the critics were not entirely wrong. Given that this is probably the last time we'll see the character on the big screen for a while, there's high expectations for Hugh Jackman to deliver. When he first started playing the character, Tobey Maguire was Spider-Man, the MCU was unheard of, it was just a dream, and the Batman franchise was pretty much dead. This is the role that brought him to stardom, and he has given us a performance that will be remembered for years to come. He's playing an older, wiser, and a bit more cynical Logan. He doesn't heal as easy, he's got scars over his body, and he has not aged well. It's hard to see a beloved character that couldn't be killed slowly breaking down and getting weaker. But that sets the overall tone of the movie, a retired hero who has lost everything and is on the verge of hopelessness. The only person who matches Jackman in the acting department is Patrick Stewart, playing Charles Xavier for the last time. Cynical and 90 years old, his mind is starting to break down. He's got an unknown brain disease and his body is becoming very weak and frail. He's barely stable and Logan is just waiting for his inevitable death. It's really depressing, but that's what makes this movie great. As a character story, it doesn't rely on any of the superhero tropes we've come to know over the years. There's no bad guy with plans to destroy the world, no army of aliens or robots, no CGI monster to fight at the end, just a deep look into characters that we've seen so much that we thought we knew them. Watching these heroes grow old and more human is what gives this movie its gritty flavor. It has the same style as old Clint Eastwood movies with maybe just a smidge of Gran Torino. To that, I give the writers full credit for a job well done. In fact, let's give them a hand. Scott Frank, Michael Green, James Mangold, thank you for giving us a well-crafted story and a complex look at the characters. One more thing I want to point out before we move on is Daphne King, who plays Laura, the little girl that Logan and Xavier protect. She doesn't speak a word for the majority of the film, and most of the sounds she makes are grunting and shouting as she slices and dices the bad guys. Yet her performance gives me confidence that she can pull off the character in future movies should the occasion arise. For a movie that's meant to be heavy with emotion, there were quite a few comedic moments. I don't have a problem with that, they all made me laugh, none of them felt forced, and they added a bit of levity. But when you consider the depressing and dreary tone of the movie, it feels out of place. Plus, the story does feel like something we've seen before. We have to get this person to this place because this guy is coming after us. So there was that feeling of deja vu, but they managed to avoid any of the cliches that usually come with this type of movie. The final point I want to make is, this movie was missing something. A little je ne sais quoi. There was a small hole that the movie didn't quite fill. It was probably the missed opportunity of bringing in Magneto or Sabretooth. Admittedly, it would have been cool to see Liev Schreiber reprise his role, but that would mean recognizing X-Men Origins as canon. And the more we let that movie fade into obscurity, the better. There was a certain character where they could have easily replaced him with Sabretooth, but for whatever reason, they decided not to. I can't say with absolute confidence that this will win Best Picture or even get nominated, and I don't want to jump on the Oscar bandwagon that is surrounding this movie, mostly because we just had the Oscars. But it does have potential for several awards. Hugh Jackman and Patrick Stewart deserve acting nominations for their incredible final performances. Scott Frank, Michael Green, and James Mangold deserve Best Original Screenplay. Mangold also deserves some recognition for his directing, as it is absolutely amazing, and maybe some other minor awards just to tally up the number of nominations. Other than the minor complaints I had earlier, this was a fantastic way to say goodbye to Hugh Jackman's Wolverine. When you put together a superhero that has this much caliber in its acting, directing, and writing, you end up with Logan, a movie that is truly a total incrediblast. What happens is that this government agent, played by John Goodman, gathers a group of scientists and explorers for an expedition to this mysterious island. A squadron of soldiers pulling out from Vietnam sign on to escort them and provide protection. They start dropping bombs, only to anger the monster ape himself, King Kong. After a rampage, the group gets separated and now they must make it to the other side of the island before Kong, or any other monsters, get them first. This was a movie I have been interested in since it was first announced. A King Kong flick that takes place entirely on the island? Sold! Now, after all the casting calls, the production news, the Comic-Con previews, and some reasonable doubt, I can say that this is one monster movie you'll go apes about. With a movie like this, you can expect some pretty big names attached to it. Such stars include John Goodman, Samuel Jackson, Tom Hiddleston, Brie Larson, Toby Kebbell, Corey Hawkins, Jen Chen, Jason Mitchell, John C. Reilly. Okay, who wasn't in this movie? But what's great about it is that it doesn't feel overcrowded or that certain characters didn't get enough screen time. On that note, the actors you do see do give off a sense of familiarity. You got Hawkins and Mitchell back together after playing Dr. Dre and Eazy-E, Toby Kebbell is in another ape-related movie, John Goodman showing up in a monster movie nearly a year after his last one, and Nick Fury, Loki, and Captain Marvel all on the big screen together before Infinity War. It's nuts to see all these actors carry a nearly 2-hour movie without it falling apart. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Jordan Vogt-Roberts in the director's chair, whose only other credit is The Kings of Summer. It's nice when a big studio like Warner Brothers give indie directors the helm to a major project, especially since this is a massive part of its monsterverse. Vogt-Roberts is able to show to us what he showed those who watched The Kings of Summer. He knows how to make an entertaining movie. Every time there's a monster on screen or there's two monsters duking it out, he lets us see it all in its glory. There's no close-ups or jump cuts, you get to see everything in its wide-shot glory. Now, while part of it does come down to the writers, whose backgrounds include Jurassic World, Godzilla, and Nightcrawler, in the end, it's Vogt-Roberts' movie. And what we get is some awesome eye candy with an interesting story to go along with it. King Kong looks amazing in this movie, and it's pretty clear that he's the star of the show. Yet, like many monster/giant robot movies, its problem is the human aspect. At first, we see these different characters get recruited, and we sort of get a feel for them. Then, when we get on the island, they all fall into tokenism. We have the handsome rogue, the crazy guy who turns out to be right, the nosy one with a million questions, the high-ranking officer who's hellbent on revenge, and the castaway who knows all the ins and outs of the place. I didn't have a problem with any of the performances, it's just that the character arcs were as predictable as you can get. Once the third act hits, you can pretty much guess what's going to happen, who's going to make it to the end, and how it happens. There's this one point in the movie where they're fighting off skull crawlers.
Sounds stupid now that I say.
And soldiers are getting picked off one by one, but only the ones you had pegged as the ones who were going to die. You know, the Expendables. No, not those guys, but that would have made a more interesting movie. When it's broken down bit by bit, Kong Skull Island is more or less what you expect. It had an interesting premise which it delivered on, it had some great visual effects and some awesome monster fights. Plenty of screen time was given to Kong. It's not like in Godzilla where the monster was just like, "Rawr, I'm Godzilla, and I'm gone." Vogt-Roberts knows exactly what we as an audience want from a creature feature, and he gives it to us. Even if the humans aren't anything special, but then again, it could be a fault on the writer's part. After all, two of them have experience with writing movies with giant monsters and underdeveloped characters. Despite that, it is a good popcorn flick with a few sparks of smart in it. And it's worth seeing at least once in theaters, maybe in IMAX if you want the full effect. Up on the 2011 sports comedy, Doug Glent, designated fighter for the Halifax Highlanders, gets a concussion on the ice that leads him to retirement. But when his team starts suffering from its new captain, he goes to ex-rival Ross Reed to whip himself back into fighting shape. The original movie was a satire of hockey fans' love for violence that had some heart to it. The sequel tries to mimic that formula, but the lack of good jokes and the increase in bad acting drags it down. Since this is a movie about hockey, it would make sense that a lot of it would take place on the ice. Director Jay Baruchel is able to show everything in close detail and make us feel as if we're on the ice with the players. You can feel the excitement of each slap shot, and you can feel the intensity of each punch. Even when we're in the locker room, you feel connected to these characters that make up the team. If you've seen the original, you'll feel right at home. If you haven't, the characters are established well enough so that you feel as if you don't have to go back and watch the original. Between the player dynamics and the fisticuffs, this truly is a sports movie. That being said, the plot is surprisingly interesting. There's a lockout going on in the Pro League, so a lot of players in the minors are being swapped around. When the guy who ended Doug's career shows up on the Highlanders side, he ends up causing problems for the team. While that's going on, Doug is training to come back so he can beat up hockey players again. This is cause for a more dramatic approach than the first one, but it does allow for some jokes that only Canadians will get, and maybe some Americans that live close enough to the border. In a nutshell, what it lacks in comedy, it makes up for in story and hockey sequences. Here's the thing with this movie, when it's about hockey, it's good, but when it's not, it's bad. There's a subplot about Doug and his wife Eva having a baby, and Alison Pill, who plays her, is as bland as a plank of wood. Somehow, all the passion and effort she had in the first movie is nowhere to be found in this one. Save for a few glimmers here and there, the character is one-dimensional and uninteresting. Speaking of watered-down characters, let's talk about Sean William Scott as Doug. His performance in the original was considered a career highlight, yet that same thunder is nowhere to be found in the sequel. And I get that his character is supposed to be dumb, but for some reason he has the literal mentality of a 6-year-old. There's one scene where he and Eva go in for an ultrasound and there's dinosaur stickers on the wall. He points to one and says, "Triceratops. That's my favorite dinosaur." Okay, was that supposed to be funny? That's the glaring issue of this movie. It thinks that if Doug says some random line that no adult would normally say, it will get the laughs. What the movie fails to recognize is that its clever commentary on hockey fights is what made the first one so much fun. Because of that, we get a poorly written mess of a follow-up that has no idea what it's doing. I think it's great that there was a Canadian-made movie that was popular enough to warrant a sequel, but whether we needed that sequel is up for debate. There's a strong enough story to carry the movie and plenty of hockey and fighting to go along with it, but the lack of any good jokes, or good acting, beats the movie down to its needs and adds a sucker punch for good measure. It's the same case as War Dogs. It's not a bad movie, it's just not a very good comedy. If you overlook some of the acting and the subplot, you'll enjoy yourself. But coming from someone who didn't feel like seeing Beauty and the Beast, I have to say that Goon and Last of the Enforcers is only worth seeing if it's at the cheap seats. Screenplay writers Rhett Reese and Paul Wernick flip genres and do a straight-up horror movie, still starring Ryan Reynolds. Along for the ride are Jake Gyllenhaal and Rebecca Ferguson, who you might recognize from Mission Impossible Rogue Nation. What happens is that there's these 6 astronauts on the International Space Station. They just received a capsule containing samples from the surface of Mars, and they discover that there's a living thing in there that feeds off other life forms. And now they have to either kill the creature or at the very least keep it from getting to Earth. It's interesting to see a duo known for the comedy to do something completely different. I like how Reese and Wernick are sort of going outside their comfort zone and sort of testing the field. But this scientific experiment was not a complete success. For some weird reason or another, I kinda like the idea that there was a really small cast. It gives us more time to focus on each person and properly develop the characters, making us feel connected to these astronauts. Jake Gyllenhaal plays a former army pilot who's about to break the record for the longest time in space, and we get a feasible idea for why he's up there for so long. Ryan Reynolds is, of course, the Joker of the group who makes light of just about everything. Rebecca Ferguson is the no-nonsense, work-focused, I take my job seriously quarantine officer. She has to make sure that if anything bad happens, it gets shut down quick. Between the 3 of them, it's Gyllenhaal that we want to spend the most time with. His military service has given him a bit of a cynical view on humanity, so he figures, I don't want to live on this planet anymore. IIS, here I come. Later on, when it just hits the fan and this jellyfish creature starts creeping around, the tone of the movie just skyrockets. Where is it hiding? Who's it going to kill next? Will they keep it from wreaking havoc down on Earth? It's truly a race against time as this thing keeps getting bigger with each victim. So imagine how big it must be after, say, 100 people. Suddenly, an xenomorph doesn't sound so bad. Now, while I applaud the Deadpool team for trying something new, I have to say it wasn't very compelling. Sure, it was creepy, the very idea that this thing was running around in a space that you're trapped in, but it didn't feel as if too much was done to make it stand out amongst other scary movies where an alien wipes out an entire crew. Not to mention the acting felt bland. Ryan Reynolds has previously worked with the writers and the director, yet he doesn't have a lot of material or that fire he had in Deadpool. Jake Gyllenhaal is a great actor. In fact, I think he's been neglected of an Oscar for quite a while now. However, this performance is not going to win him a statue as it had very little energy unless the alien was on screen. It was this weird pattern where it's like, yeah, it's nice, I guess. The view is great. That's great. Yeah, so anyway, Earth sucks. I like being in space. Rebecca Ferguson does an okay job, but again, it's dull and not very appealing. So the acting and the writing isn't so good. What about the cinematography? All space movies have great cinematography. It's steady for the most part, but it only stood out when there was shaky cam and there was a lot of cutting back and forth, and my eyes hurt just trying to follow along. It's a shame that a horror movie with the same writers, budget, and star of a great comedy was unable to deliver. The concept was neat, the special effects were cool, but the writing was weak and the cinematography was either generic or headache-inducing. Also, the characters never really got any proper backstories other than Gyllenhaal's. When looking back on life, it's a pretty standard sci-fi thriller that won't be remembered. I did like the twist at the end, but that wasn't enough to cover up the flaws of this movie. I'm just hoping it wasn't a setup for a sequel, because it ain't happening. It's an alright movie at best, and probably best worth seeing if it's at the cheap seats. It takes place in the city of Tokyo in a time in the future where people can get cybernetic body parts. The plot goes like this. Scarlett Johansson plays a woman named Mira Killian who was in a terrible accident and had her brain transferred to a robot body. Now she works as a major in the Anti-Terrorism Bureau, Section 9, where she is currently hunting down a cyber terrorist known as Kuze. Right when the casting call was first made, it seemed as if this movie was doomed from the start. As if the whitewashing backlash wasn't enough, the trailers made it look like a copy-paste version of the Total Recall remake, and it was helmed by Snow White and the Huntsman director Rupert Sanders. Not to mention the fact that Aaron Kruger, best known for his work on Transformers 2, was on the writing team. So given all this, you would expect a terrible movie, but what should have been a disaster is actually an entertaining sci-fi action flick with some great visuals and cool characters, even if the philosophy feels too direct. First thing you notice about this movie are the visuals, which are absolutely gorgeous. The effects and the cinematography blend together to create this world that's full of color and liveliness. A welcome change, as most dystopian movies look drab and gray and depressing. It just goes to show that you can have a movie take place in the future without sticking to a single color template. So in a nutshell, the world of Ghost in the Shell is pretty lively. Speaking of lively, let's talk about the action sequences. The gunfights are reminiscent of that to Jason Bourne, the martial arts aspect was well executed, and they're shot in various angles so they stand out from your run-of-the-mill spy thriller action sequences, and they're also more appealing. Again, the cinematography is amazing. We also have a pretty interesting cast of characters. First off, we got Bateau, Major's partner. He hangs out with Major a lot outside of work to sort of show her what it means to be human and how to connect to this living, breathing world. Basically trying to help her find what she deems normal. Next on the character list, we got Togusa, who allegedly had a bigger role in the original. He's an old-fashioned type of guy. He'd rather rely on sweat and muscle rather than machine. An understandable state of mind, as this is a world where if somebody's kidney failed, they could just go out tomorrow and get a new one. And if that kidney fails, they can just go out and get a new one again. And on until the person eventually dies. But not for Togusa. He's living his life as if there was no cybernetic body part that's going to come him and set him right again. Finally, we have Chief Daisuke Aramaki, played by famous Japanese actor and director Takeshi Kitano. Now, being the head of an anti-terrorism bureau can be tough, but he also has to put up a lot with Honka, the cybernetics company that gave Major her robotic body. Every time she screws up or even slightly steps out of line, Honka comes in and says, "You better get her under control or we're pulling the plug." But of course, he's seen a lot of stuff, so this doesn't sway him at all. She may answer to you, but I answer to the Prime Minister. A very noble trait, someone who sticks to their values and doesn't let any other outside parties persuade them. Funny thing is, he's the only actor who has subtitles, yet he has the best lines of the entire movie. But then again, Kitano does do a good performance. In fact, a good majority of the cast do a good job. And on the subject of Johansson, I have to give credit where credit is due. And while I do agree she wasn't the best choice for the role, she does a better job than expected. You know the phrase, action speaks louder than words? Well, this is a movie where that phrase rings true. Every time she walks, it's very brisk, and she feels very uptight. Although you have to remember that she is a robot that's specifically designed for combat and investigation. So it makes sense that she has a style of movement that matches up to her militant attitude. And as we go through this movie, we see her character progress. She's trying to figure out what it means to be human, while also wrestling with a past that she can't seem to remember. Unfortunately, as much as we enjoy seeing Major's character development, it's undermined by the same monotone voice that Scarlett Johansson had as Black Widow and Lucy. Now, how bad is it?
Maybe next time you can design me better. Everyone around me, they feel connected to something.
Yeah, that's pretty much her dialogue throughout the entire movie. Come on, I've seen Hail Caesar, she has more range to her voice than just angsty robot. But I digress. Maybe this is just the result of her being typecast as a female lead badass with the deadpan eyes. Whether or not that is the case, at least she manages to avoid falling into a cliched archetype like Peter Ferdinando's character, Cutter. Cutter is the CEO of Honka, so of course when Major steps out of line, he goes to speak to Chief Aramaki, they have their little bit, and then he goes back to doing whatever he does. That's the problem with Cutter. He's a one-dimensional character that we don't really care about. And if you've even seen the trailer, then you know that he's probably going to be a villain by the end of the movie. I'm saying probably because I want to keep this spoiler-free, but then again, saying Cutter might be a villain is like saying Superman might be a superhero. But the worst part is that the movie doesn't even try to hide it. From the moment you see him and when you first listen to him talk, you can tell right away, yep, he's gonna be the bad guy. Okay, we can move on. But let's talk about Kuze, played by Michael Pitt, no relation to Brad. Yeah, unfortunately, he's also a lame villain. Mainly due to the fact that, like Johansson, he has a static voice that barely changes. What's weird is that in the trailer, it sounded full of life and almost human. Yet in the final product, it's devoid of any humanity and he ends up sounding like an angsty teenage version of Ultron. Now, this wouldn't bother me as much had more tweaking been done to the story. But then again, if you have the writer of Transformers 4 on your team, then what can you expect? I mean, it's not the worst story, it was okay for what it was, but the structure was predictable and the twist doesn't hit as home as the movie would like it to. I think there's a lot of unnecessary criticism surrounding this movie because they had a white actress playing the lead. But, without giving too much away, having the character being played by a non-Japanese actress is actually a key factor to the story. Even before the movie came out, I didn't have a problem with the ethnicity of the actress playing the lead role. In fact, there's a whole bunch of people out there who didn't have a problem. Even Mamoru Oshii, the director of the original 1995 anime movie, didn't have any objections of Johansson playing the character. He even told IGN, "The Major is a cyborg, and her physical form is an entirely assumed one. The name Motoko Kusanagi and her current body are not her original name and body, so there is no basis for saying that an Asian actress must portray her. Even if her original body, presuming such a thing existed, were a Japanese one, that would still apply. I can only sense a political motive from the people opposing it, and I believe artistic expression must be free from politics." So if he doesn't have a problem with it, why should we? Granted, I don't think Johansson's performance was fantastic, but she does make the material work and embraces the character as best as she can. The same could be said for all the actors in this movie. It's just unfortunate that Ferdinando and Pitt got the short end of the stick with their roles as villains. Although what matters to me is that they didn't go the route I thought they would. A Total Recall wannabe with better visuals and a female lead. You could argue that there's some similarity in design and style, but other than that, that's all there is to it. I haven't seen enough from the original anime franchise to do a fair comparison, but from what I've seen, they've stuck pretty close to the source material. So is it just another botched Hollywood remake? Well, I'd say it's more of an adaptation, but more in the way Assassin's Creed or Captain America Civil War are adaptations. A lot of it does borrow from a singular source, but it does make reference and even take influence from all aspects of the franchise. And the best part about this broad type of adaptation is that it makes longtime fans feel comfortable without scaring away any newcomers. As far as I'm concerned, this is just another entry in the series. They've looked to the material for inspiration, taken some aspects of it that they liked, and then came up with their own unique interpretation. It's not the original movie or the series being remade, it's a standalone live-action movie that can join the ranks of the franchise. So, in spite of the controversy, when all is said and done, Ghost in the Shell is definitely worth seeing at least once in theaters in IMAX. The crew is back together once again, but this time, Dom's gone rogue. He's betrayed his family and is working with Cypher, the most dangerous terrorist in the world. Because she's impossible to find, Mr. Nobody brings in Deckard Shaw in hopes that they can work together and bring her down. After seeing Furious 7, one could have easily assumed that that was the end of the franchise. The story was wrapped up nicely, the characters of Brian and Mia were properly retired, and it ended on a very heartfelt note. See you again? Still gets me. So it came as a surprise to many when Vin Diesel announced that there would be another trilogy of films to close out the series. This, of course, is one of those three. And while the franchise has overstayed its welcome, its final chapter is off to a great start. One thing that caught me off guard was Vin Diesel's performance. It was actually pretty good. When I first walked into the theater, I never thought Vin Diesel would cry in an action flick. Or any movie for that matter. It's almost as if he realizes how much the series has done for him and is finally trying to put in some effort before it ends. He still has that trademark mumble growl, but at least there's some passion behind it. Also, fresh off another adrenaline-fueled car chase is Charlize Theron playing the role of Cypher, the cyber terrorist who is freakishly intimidating. She's always very calm and collected, even when she's mad. That's what makes her a great villain. You don't know whether she's happy about what someone did or if she's wanting to kill them. She was a huge addition to the series, and hopefully she comes back for number 9. On the subject of new additions, Scott Eastwood plays Mr. Nobody's trainee, Little Nobody. Although judging by his character, I'm guessing he was supposed to be a replacement for Brian. I mean, think about it. A by-the-book law officer who's good at driving fast, learns to let loose and become a part of the crew. The similarities are so close it's freaky. I don't know if that was their intention, but regardless, I like what Scott Eastwood did with the role. Hopefully he comes back for movie number 9. One cool thing that they've done with the story is that they made it connect with the past 3 movies. Much like how in Spectre they revealed that Le Chiffre, Dominic Green, and Silver were all agents of Spectre, in this movie they do something similar but with the Shaw brothers. I won't say anything because that would be considered a spoiler, but the revelation that Cypher has had a hand in everything makes you wonder. How far back does this go? We'll probably get our answer in the next 2 movies unless they decide to go to 11. The action is cool and the humor and drama balances out really well, but other than that, I can't really say anything else about it. Now, while I did enjoy the acting, the story, and just about everything else, there was a bit of a sense of deja vu. I mean, sure, nobody expected the franchise to last as long as it did, but with Fast 5, they managed to step up their game. However, it's clear that they're running out of ideas because the plot structure was very similar to Fast and Furious 6. A member of their crew is a bad guy now, they have to work with someone they fought against in the last movie, good guys win, and it ends with an outdoor barbecue. This could be a problem since the series is meant to last until 2021 and we're always seeing storylines from 4 years ago being repeated. I guess it is a bit of improvement making the same movie for 8 years straight. In fact, what separates this from, say, a bland spy thriller with fast cars is the writing. But no matter how good the dialogue is or how well the story progresses, the stupidity that is impossible stunts and destruction overload brings down the film's value. That's not to say a good movie can't have action sequences or lots of CGI, but when it's used in freakishly impossible ways, it loses its sense of realism. Wow, never thought I'd be saying that about an F&F movie. At first glance, this movie may seem like another entry in a franchise that is getting older than its target demographic. When you look at the $1.5 billion that Furious 7 made, you'd think they'd slap on some half-baked product onto the screen and hope for the same result. Luckily for us, The Fate of the Furious feels like a unique entry even if there's a little bit of deja vu. Although it had a smaller opening than Furious 7 at $98 million compared to F7's $147 million, it managed to break The Force Awakens' international opening by a mere $17 million. Like I said in a previous episode, the Fast and Furious movies try to put effort into their work no matter how brainless they may get. The difference between this and a movie like Return of Xander Cage is that Fast 8 takes a new element and integrates it into the series and makes it work. Xander Cage just takes everything we know from action/spy movies, puts it in a blender, pours it out for us, and hopes that we'll buy into it. And judging by the North American box office, I'd say we've done a pretty good job of distinguishing bad from good. Even though it somehow made over $300 million worldwide, regardless of that, at least this movie is getting the attention it deserves. It's not a movie I could watch for hours on end, but it is a movie definitely worth seeing multiple times, whether it is at the theater or on Blu-ray. Free Fire is an action flick from A24, the king of the indie film market. It has an all-star cast of Charlotte Copley, Armie Hammer, Brie Larson, Academy Award winner Brie Larson, Cillian Murphy, and Jack Rayner. Look, I get that she won the Oscar in a movie that you guys produced, but you don't have to milk it. What happens is that these IRA members are buying guns from a South African arms dealer. They get the wrong weapons, the tensions rise, somebody fires a gun, another gun is fired, and before you know it, they're all having a shootout. This is one of those movies where if it's playing near you, consider yourselves lucky. A24 is known for delivering solid movies with limited releases. They're releasing 18 movies this year alone. To put that in perspective, how many is Disney releasing this year? Yeah, that's right. An indie company is pumping out twice as many films as the biggest production company on the planet. Now, with this many movies, you're bound to come across some that aren't quite as good. Well, if they are any, then this ain't one of them. Right when the movie begins, you get this Tarantino sense of style. The 70s music, the cinematography, the light yet serious overtone. You could technically classify this as a dark comedy considering how over the top this movie goes. It starts out smooth and calm, but within minutes guns are drawn, you got both sides trying to shoot each other, but they both want to leave with what they came for. You got this one side that wants to leave with the guns, and the other side that wants to leave with the money. And keep in mind, this is all taking place inside a warehouse, so you can imagine the close awkwardness they must feel. They don't really want to kill each other, but they have to out of principle. It's kind of like they're communicating to each other, I don't want to shoot you, but I kind of have to, cause we're shooting each other. What's funny is that this could have easily been a play. Given the simple setup, the very few scene changes, and the amount of plot-driven dialogue, you could very easily convert this from screen to stage. Denzel Washington did the opposite with Fences, so who's to say it can't be done for Free Fire? I just like to point out that Charlotte Copley is hands down the best part of the movie. Not that everybody else did a bad job, I just felt like his character stood out the most. He's cool, he's calm and collected and very stylish, but he can go crazy at the drop of a hat. Now that I'm done singing this movie's praises, it's time to talk about some things I didn't like. For starters, the comedy isn't exactly the movie's strongest point. I got a few chuckles out of it, but there never was a joke that got me bursting out laughing and falling out of my seat. But because of that, the tone felt a bit off balance. It never did get super serious or dark, but there were a couple moments where I thought to myself, this is supposed to be funny, right? At one point, I thought there was going to be a twist that one of them was a cop, but once a certain character died, I thought, okay, maybe not. But then that person comes back to life somehow, and they set up the twist again, and I thought to myself, if they reveal this person as a cop, I'm going to be really annoyed. Then the movie ends, and I'm left thinking, well, why didn't you go ahead with the twist? It's a catch-22. I was annoyed that they didn't go ahead with the twist, but then again, I would have been annoyed if they did. This is probably one of the only indie hits I will be seeing in theaters this year. The rest I'll be checking out on Netflix. However, I don't regret buying a ticket for this movie, and I don't think you will either. It does have a bit of an uneven tone and some weak comedy, but it does have some awesome performances, a concept that we don't see a whole lot in movies nowadays, and a whole lot of guns. If you find out Free Fire is playing at a theater near you, I say you should definitely go check it out at least once in theaters. Based on the book of the same name, The Circle is about a young woman named May Holland who lands a job at a company called, you guessed it, The Circle. She rises through the ranks and earns the respect of company head Iman Bailey, played by Tom Hanks, who offers her the chance to test out a new surveillance software. However, one of her fellow employees, played by John Boyega, warns her that the company may not be as it seems, and that her actions have dire consequences. This was a movie I stumbled upon by chance. I only remember seeing the trailer once, and that was when I went to see the movie Gold. So of course I did some digging to find out more on the subject. First off, it was written and directed by James Ponsard, whose last movie, The End of the Tour, was considered one of the best of 2015. He's not exactly a huge name in Hollywood, but every movie he's done so far has been met with critical acclaim. So you can imagine my surprise when I say that this movie is James Ponsard's first blunder. I will say this about Emma Watson, she knows how to carry a film. We get to follow her character around for the duration of the movie, and by sharing the experience with her, we get a sense of what it's like to be in her shoes. Tom Hanks does a solid job as Amon, like this is the type of guy you would want to have as your boss. Then again, it is Tom Hanks we're talking about. Even when playing a bad guy, there's something undeniably likable about him. On the flip side, this movie has way too many problems to begin with. First off is the writing. Dave Eggers, who wrote the book, also helped write the screenplay. You'd think the author of the source material would be a huge help in converting it into film. But as this movie proves, that is not the case. I haven't read the book, so I can't draw any comparisons, but something tells me this was supposed to be longer than an hour and 50 minutes. The reason I say that is because this movie has so many characters, but the movie has no idea how to use them. Stars John Boyega as Cowden. Now, Boyega does an alright job, but considering the character he's playing, he has a very limited screen time. Maybe he was busy filming The Last Jedi, and this was just something he managed to squeeze in on the weekend. I think in the book he's a much bigger character, but in the movie, all he does is show up to remind me that the Circle is bad. In fact, just about every scene that he's in could be summed up with, the Circle is evil, bye! It's a bad pattern that this movie falls into with its characters. We introduce them, we spend maybe 1 or 2 scenes with them, then they disappear until the plot calls for them to be relevant again. We get ideas of who we're supposed to care about, but why do we care about them? It feels like the only reason they exist is so that May can interact with them from time to time. Well, we get our 2D cutout characters that offer no depth and no reason for us to get emotionally attached to them. There's also no real progression of the plot. The whole movie feels like the first act, and then the 2 acts are smacked so close together that by the time you think something big is about to happen, it's over. Even though we see change throughout the movie, it still feels as if we're establishing some of the basics. This is one scene that is meant to represent the climax of the movie, so we should get some falling action, see what happens next, and how the story develops. But then, 10 minutes after that scene, the movie's over, and you're just sitting there like, is that it? Again, I feel like this movie could have benefited from a longer runtime. Worst thing you could do with a cool concept is make a bad movie out of it. That is probably the worst crime in filmmaking. And sadly, The Circle is a prime example of a neat idea with bad execution. In a movie where you have one or two-dimensional characters, an uneven pace, no clarity in tone, and a rushed ending, it overshadows the strong lead. While the technology in the movie is a few steps ahead of what we have now, it never steps beyond the realm of possibility. I wouldn't be surprised if a company like Google or Apple did something like this within the next decade or so. This is another movie I have seen without checking the source material first, so I can't really say how well it stacks up to the book. Hopefully Dave Eggers is a better author than screenwriter, otherwise this book is going to be a major letdown. As for the director James Ponsard, well, I wish him better luck next time. There isn't much to remember about this movie, so it's best just seeing if it's on Netflix. This time around, Lightning McQueen is a seasoned pro who's slipping up in the racing game. The racers from his generation are retiring in order to make way for this new breed of technologically advanced racers. But McQueen's saying, you know what, I'm deciding when I'm done. I'm going to keep on going and I'm going to win one more race and prove to you I still got it. So he sets off to train and beat his rival Jackson Storm in one more race before he's forced to retire. We all know how low Pixar went last time, so it was only natural to assume that the follow-up would either be a bigger disaster or a massive improvement. Having said that, it does make us forget Cars 2, but it does nothing to stand out as its own unique movie. Whether or not you love the trilogy, and yes, it is a trilogy, one thing that is undeniably good about it are the racing sequences. I'm not gonna lie, there were a few moments that legitimately had me on the edge of my seat. You put the cinematography and the animation and you smack them together, and you got proof as to why Pixar has been relevant for so long. I have to give them credit for putting the focus back on racing. They realized that making Mater an international spy wasn't cutting it, so they tossed that idea right out the window. You could tell that they wanted to bury that mistake because Mater is barely in this movie at all. Surprisingly, there's a bit of a heavy overtone in this movie. McQueen sees this new blood and realizes that he's no longer the aspiring rookie that he once was. Nothing lasts forever, and that one day he's going to have to say, that's it, that's the end of my run. Wow, a heavy theme in a Cars movie and I didn't even realize it. Well played, Pixar. Well played. Now, you gotta have some levity among some of the serious moments if you want to have a balanced movie. And Pixar are at their best when the comedy is just as good as the drama. And unfortunately, in this movie, both fall flat. Early in, you could tell that this was made with no consideration for the older members of the audience. And it sucks because you know that Pixar is better at this. They can make movies that are for all ages. Toy Story, Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, Inside Out, not only did they have themes that both kids and adults could relate to, but they also hit the right emotional notes with everybody. Moments to laugh, moments to cry, moments to be thrilled, moments to be a little bit scared. And then you have the Cars franchise, which has been the scapegoat for making a quick buck and selling some merchandise. It's actually amazing how little effort Pixar can put into a feature film and still make a hit. Let's take a look at the story. McQueen is facing an impossible opponent. He is pressed to retire. He gets a trainer who he feels is holding him back. Something happens that causes a rift between the two, but they reconcile just in time for the big race. And you can pretty much guess the outcome from there. When all is said and done, Cars 3 is far from Pixar's best, but it's not quite its worst either. It has its moments where it shines, but also just as many where it fades. The kids might get a kick out of it for the fast-paced, brightly colored animation, and some of the older kids might watch it for the nostalgia factor, but for everyone else, and that's mostly people on the adult side of the spectrum, there's really nothing for them here. It's the best of the three, I'll give it that, but considering the trilogy's track record, that's really not saying much. Unless you need to entertain the kids for a little while, it's best worth seeing if it's at the cheap seats. After realizing that the mains were better off in the background, Illumination gives us their fourth and hopefully final entry in the Despicable Me franchise. This time, Gru and his wife Lucy are fired from the Hero Agency because they failed to capture Balthazar Brat. Sheesh, if that's what it takes to get fired, I'd hate to see the hiring process. Eventually, Gru is contacted by his long-lost twin brother Drew. He goes to his island and the two hit it off. After locating a priceless diamond in Balthazar's lair, Gru is convinced to go back to Villainy for one last heist. Say what you will, but I liked the first two Despicable Me movies. They were fun, fresh, and had just the right amount of humor that all ages could enjoy. When it came to the Minions movie, I passed up on it, and according to some of my favorite internet critics, I wasn't missing much. I do hope this film is the last one because at this point, the franchise has run its course. The most notable thing about the movie is the casting of Trey Parker as the villain. Interesting choice considering what he's most famous for. His character is a former child actor who's building a giant robot so he can use a diamond to get revenge on Hollywood for making him irrelevant. Part of me makes me wonder if Trey Parker looked at the script and said, this character sounds like someone from a South Park episode. I'll do it. By the way, are you fed up with the Minions? Well, turns out they're now a subplot in the movie that barely lasts 20 minutes of screen time, so good news if you're sick of yellow mutants in overalls. Yep, that's what they are, mutated strands of DNA. Don't know whose DNA, but the less we question it, the better. Steve Carell does a flawless job voicing Gru and Drew. Now, voicing two different characters isn't unheard of, but what makes this special is the vastly different personalities the brothers have. Gru is an introvert who wants to bury his past, and Drew is the lavishly wealthy opposite who wants to be a great villain. When you have these two opposites meet, it makes for some pretty interesting scenarios. Unfortunately, there's only so many times you can retell a story before it gets stale, and Despicable Me 3 falls victim to said staleness. Now, this wouldn't be so bad if the humor was appealing. There are some good jokes here and there, but it never quite reaches the belly-laughing momentum set by the first two. It definitely has better humor than Cars 3, but that's not saying much. A good chunk of it still relies on the Minions, and like I said, they're barely in the movie at all. So bottom line, the humor is pretty weak. Now back on the subject of the story. The structure is literally the same as the last two. Bad guy has something Gru wants. Gru goes to steal it. Family gets in the way, but ultimately he gets the thing and everybody's happy. Whoops, I just spoiled the whole movie. When we first entered this world in 2010, it was an original idea that was loved by many. Now it's evolving into a cash grab scheme thanks to its army of comic relief. It's kinda like that college kid who always wants to party. Dude, why are you doing this? You graduated 2 years ago. You gotta get ready for the real world. I think that's the mentality Illumination has right now, and I think that's the mentality that they need to let go. Yes, it was their first movie, and yes, it was a smash hit, but it's time to explore other options. You don't see Pixar constantly relying on their first movie to... Whether you enjoy this movie or not really depends on how much you enjoyed the original too. Don't avoid the movie if you didn't like Minions, go to the movie if you like Despicable Me too. If you've lost interest in the series, that's fine, just wait to go see it at the cheap seats. But if you're like me and skipped out on Minions, then you should see it at least once in theaters. In the third entry of the Rap Cinematic universe following Notorious and Straight Outta Compton, no, I'm kidding, there's no such thing as the Rap Cinematic universe, but following in the spirit of those movies, All Eyes on Me tells the story of Tupac Shakur's life, including his rise to fame, his beef with Biggie Smalls, his controversial time at Death Row Records, and his tragic death. Considering how well the biopic for NWA was handled, I figured that the next adaptation of a rapper's life would be a shoo-in for success. I even went as far as to predict that it would become one of the highest grossing movies of the summer. Domestically, that is. But as you're about to find out, I am more wrong about this movie than Roland Emmerich's prediction of 2012. Probably the best part of this movie is Demetrius Shipp Jr.'s performance as Tupac. And not just the way he looks, but also in his mannerisms and the way he acts, he looks like the real deal. Probably the best examples of his performance are when he's rapping. Granted, most of it was probably dubbed, but when you actually hear him rap live, you'd swear that Tupac has come back to life and is now on the big screen rapping for you. The only person who matches Demetrius performance-wise is Danny Gurira, who does an incredible job as Tupac's mother, Afeni Shakur. You may recognize her from Michonne of The Walking Dead, but the energy and passion she puts into this role makes her completely stand out from a TV character. If she ends up getting more movie roles, this will be known as her breakout role. Now, it wouldn't be a rap biopic without the music, and when those famous songs come over the speakers and fill the theater, it really feels as if you're at a Tupac concert. It had that same concert feel that Straight Outta Compton had. Big props to the people behind the sound editing and sound mixing. I feel as if they're the unsung heroes of the movie industry. Your movie could have the best cinematography and amazing acting, but if it sounds bad, then the entire movie loses its value as a whole because you had that one area that was slipping up. The big problems I had with this movie was the way it was edited and how the story was told. When we start off, Tupac is being incarcerated at the Clinton Correction Facility, and he's being interviewed about his rise to fame. This wouldn't be so bad if it weren't for the constant jumping between the past and the present. The occasional cutting back and forth is fine, but when the first 2 acts of your movie rely on this technique, it comes off as lazy filmmaking and trying way too hard to be artsy. It's distracting. It gets to a point where you're wondering how long is this scene going to last until we cut to the next one. It becomes less and less of a movie and more of a montage of clips. Speaking of the editing, if you were to put this movie in chronological order, you would notice huge jumps in time. He goes from college to being in a rap club to being a backup singer to making the movie Juice all in a matter of minutes. There's no dramatic build-up, it's just scene, and scene, and scene. Flashback, flashback, flashback. For example, the story behind his thug life tattoo. The reason he got it is because he saw a young boy getting shot in the park and die in his mother's arms. It's meant to be a touching moment, but that whole scene happens in the space of 2 minutes. Like I said, no dramatic build-up, no time to connect or resonate with Tupac. A grand majority of the movie could be introduce the scene, have something happen, and then cut back to him being in prison. It's not so much about diving into Tupac's life as it is about just recreating iconic moments. To make matters worse, the camera was always unstable. You can tell a lot of the shots were handheld because the frame was always bouncing up and down. It makes it hard to focus on a scene when the edges of it are doing the most action. It's always disappointing when a movie you've been looking forward to turns out to be less than what you expected. I really wanted to like this movie. I wanted to love it. It's a nice introduction, I'll give it that, but for those who know his story, it feels like a dramatization of his Wikipedia page. The performances are strong and the music's great, but other than that, this movie falls flat on its face. The shaky cam, the jumbled editing, the plot that tells us everything we already know with no dramatic edge, it really is a disservice to any Tupac fan. I really want to say it's worth paying money to go see, but there's not enough pros to justify that, not even for a cheap seat pricing. I hate to say it, but it's only worth watching if it's on Netflix.
Taking place a few months after the events of the first movie, the Guardians find themselves in battle with this alien race called the Sovereign People. They end up crash landing on a planet, and then this mysterious ally comes out of nowhere and helps them out. Turns out it's Peter's dad, Ego. But evil arises as they have to save the galaxy and perhaps the entire universe once again. Ever since the first Guardians movie struck a chord with audiences in 2014, people have come to love the weird side of Marvel. If it weren't for that movie, we probably wouldn't have Ant-Man or Doctor Strange. So in response to the positive reception, a sequel was scheduled for the first weekend in May, a summer spot that Marvel pretty much owns at this point. And while it is one of Marvel's better sequels, it doesn't quite catch lightning in a bottle twice. Because this only takes place a few months after the first one, there's still that dysfunctional family unit, and there's a leadership rivalry between Peter Quill and Rocket that turns sour pretty quickly. This causes a rift within the group that stays there until the final act. Speaking of family, Kurt Russell is a welcome addition to the Marvel Cinematic Universe as Peter's dad, a Celestial named Ego. I guess we solved the mystery of why he's called Star-Lord. Chemistry between Chris Pratt and Kurt Russell felt very real. I did not doubt for a moment that these characters were father and son. The 28-year age gap between Pratt and Russell doesn't hurt either. They also brought back Yondu and Nebula, two minor antagonists from the first movie who are key contributors to the story and fully flesh out characters in this one. We learn a lot about Yondu through Peter Quill and a lot about Nebula through Gamora. And let's just say the reason these two don't get along is because they have some major daddy issues. To see how that ties into Infinity War will be interesting. Very, very, very interesting. Even though Thanos doesn't make a cameo appearance this time around, we still have a pretty cool villain. No, not her, but I'll get to that later. The best part about this movie's villain is that you don't know who it is until the final act. It's almost like Marvel gave us a kidney punch and went, haha, didn't expect that one now, did ya? I won't say who it is, cause I gotta keep the spoiler free for the 5 people who haven't seen it yet. Humor has always been a driving factor in the MCU, but the Guardians have always held the most comedic value. But ever since Batman v Superman, I felt that Marvel has been trying a little bit too hard to have their movies recognized as the funny ones. While that wasn't so much the case with Civil War and Doctor Strange, Guardians 2 is a prime example of that theory. I like superhero movies that can make me laugh, but I also want to be shocked.
maybe even cry a little. This movie had some emotional moments, but they're almost always undercut by a joke. Especially in the last part of the movie, when the tensions are incredibly high, yet the characters are just coming up with something that's witty and snappy. I felt like when he was at that part of the script, James Gunn was constantly asking himself, how can I make the audience laugh? The more this movie goes on, the less it feels like a superhero movie and more like a comedy that just so happens to have superheroes in it. It had the same problem as the first Avengers movie. They kept the team split up for a good chunk of it and only brought them together back at the end for the final battle and to do the epic trailer shot. This is part of the reason why I say Age of Ultron is the better Avengers movie. Also, Ayesha was highly undeveloped as a villain and a character. It felt like she was only there to promote for Guardians 3 or Avengers Untitled Sequel. She was still a bit of a driving force in the movie as she sends the Ravagers to go after the Guardians. But then she shows up later with her own army and it just doesn't make any sense. Why hire a bunch of bottom-of-the-barrel bounty hunters to go after them when you can send your own soldiers? After several months of waiting, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 doesn't quite live up to the hype. It had great chemistry and awesome soundtracks, some pretty cool action sequences, and amazing special effects, but it was boggled down by universe building, having too much comedy, and for keeping the team apart for most of the runtime. I'm glad I saw it, but I don't see myself picking up the Blu-ray in the foreseeable future. I know it's out of theaters now, but my rating would be to see it at least once in theaters.
Hold on! Holy.
Taking place a decade before the events of Alien, it follows the crew of a ship called the Covenant. They're on a mission to a planet, but they get a transmission from the far reaches of space that may or may not be human. They figure, well, it's only a couple days off course, let's go check it out. But as they're about to learn, sometimes the road less traveled is best left alone. I haven't followed the Alien franchise as closely as most people, but I do know that Prometheus was a less than impressive movie. While the sequel to a prequel is a good horror with strong performances and interesting themes, it can't help but be brought down by a predictable plot structure and giving more questions than answers. Since this is a horror franchise, it would make sense for there to be a bunch of scary moments. And believe me, they are aplenty. What I liked was how they handled the jump scares. They sort of let you on and let you know what was coming before they sprung the moment on you. Ultimately, what made this movie scary was the creepy imagery and knowing that there was an xenomorph out there, but you just didn't know when it was going to strike. Standouts in this movie are Katherine Waterston, Michael Fassbender in a duo role, and surprisingly, Danny McBride. Waterston plays Jeanette Daniels, who's in charge of terraforming for the Covenant's mission. Her character is, in a way, similar to that to Sigourney Weaver's Ellen Ripley. When it's going down, she immediately takes action. She gets everybody together and is the first to grab a gun. Fassbender plays Walter and David, two androids who were both created by Weyland, although they couldn't be more different from each other. Walter is an assistant to the crew of the Covenant who just wants to do good, whereas David, on the other hand, is the last surviving member of the Prometheus mission and has no empathy for human life. It's awesome to see Fassbender play these characters who, although they have the same creator, have very different ideologies. That's what I liked about this movie. It dives deep into the themes of life and creation. When a creation is made, you don't know how it's going to adapt, how it's going to survive, what's its thought process, what rules does it live by. Now, when you write a script, you need your characters to have multiple traits, otherwise they're just shells of humans in a story. Well, they all share a trait. They're dumb. I'm sorry, but it's true. Right from the get-go, they all make stupid decisions. There are scenes in this movie that would not have happened had the characters made better, smarter choices. But because we have to have death in this movie, the characters are made to be morons with no common sense. By the way, do you remember those burning questions you had after watching Prometheus? Hold on to those, because at the rate this franchise is going, you're never going to get them answered anyway. I'm just as curious as the other guy. What are these black spores? What is the black goo? Where does it come from? If the xenomorphs were known to be killing machines with acid blood, why did the engineers bother creating them anyway? So many questions, but no answers. I've said it once and I'll say it again. I've never been a fan of the Alien franchise, but what's clear to me is that Ridley Scott loves to build his universe off the back of unanswered questions. Although there are some notable performances, core effects, and interesting themes, the dumb characters, the glaring plot holes, and the unanswered questions keep this movie from joining the ranks of the 1979 classic. Don't first open your chest or your wallet over this one and see it at the cheap seats. Hey there guys, how are you? It's me, the Canadian Movie Buff, with a review of Pirates of the Caribbean: Dead Men Tell No Tales. Captain Jack Sparrow is in trouble once again. This time he's been hunted by Captain Salazar, a captain of the Spanish Navy fleet. Now here's the thing about Captain Salazar. He was notorious for wiping pirates off the face of the earth. Or in this case, off the face of the sea. Basically, if you mess with him, you were in big trouble. What Jack Sparrow did was lure him into the Bermuda Triangle and left him to die. But since this is a world where dead people come back to life all the time, we have this movie. Jack Sparrow's only hope is to find the legendary Trident of Poseidon, which gives its bearer total control of the seas. The last Pirates movie was a dud, to say the least, having suffered a 4-year hiatus yet doing nothing new with the franchise. Now, after a 6-year hiatus, the series is back with another installment to make up for the mistakes of the past and to bring the franchise back to its roots. However, it has yet to learn the most important lesson any film series could have: adapt or die. And this one does not adapt. I cannot complain about Johnny Depp's performance. He has a love and passion for the role that's not very common in Hollywood today. Having had some time off away from the Pirates movies, making Black Mass and the upcoming Murder on the Orient Express, he returns to the part with a new sense of energy that the fourth movie really lacked. All I can say is, welcome back, Captain Jack. Now, I don't know what it is with Javier Bardem, but he always seems to be cast as the stoic, creepy, and unsettling villain who has very little facial movement throughout the whole thing. But that's what he's best at, and he really brings it to the role of Captain Salazar. Funny I should mention that. His wife, Penelope Cruz, played Blackbeard's daughter in On Stranger Tides. Yep, I actually remember the title. This movie also brought back that dark tone that had really been fading away after The Curse of the Black Pearl. I mean, the undead villains are genuinely freaky. At the screening I went to, I saw a couple come in with a baby. 10 minutes into the movie, they were gone. That's a fun way to scar your newborn child. Bring him to a movie where people are missing body parts. Can't say it's their fault. They probably saw the Disney logo and figured, hey, family-friendly fun. Okay, this has been going on for the past couple movies, and I think it's safe for me to put my foot down. This movie literally has the same plot structure as the other sequels. Jack has to find MacGuffin before some dude from his past does. Jeez, how many undead enemies does this guy have? Next thing you know, they're going to be bringing back Davy Jones. Speaking of the Flying Dutchman, where if you remember from The World's End, Will Turner becomes the captain of that ship, guess how much screen time he has? I'm not even joking. 2 minutes. He was one of the movie's biggest selling points, and yet they make him a glorified cameo. I thought this movie was going to be the epic reunion of the heroes from the original trilogy. Instead, we get to hang out with the kid, Henry Turner. He's annoying. Moving on. There's a love story attached. Moving on. What, I can't skip it? Alright, fine. The love story felt forced, unnatural, and cliched as hell. Can we just go to the final verdict before I remember how bad this movie actually was? Bottom line, Pirates of the Caribbean 5: Dead Men Tell No Tales is disappointing. The plot structure was exactly the same as the last three, making it really easy to predict how the movie was going to go. The love story was uncalled for, the long-awaited return of Will Turner and Elizabeth Swann was swept under the rug, and their kid was annoying. Johnny Depp and Javier Bardem do save this movie with their performances, and because of that, it saves the movie from a Netflix watch to worth seeing at the cheap seats. This reboot is about Tom Cruise playing a US military man turned treasure hunter who stumbles upon an ancient tomb thought to be lost. Unluckily for him, he just so happens to awaken an ancient evil that has been sealed away for thousands of years. Now that the princess is back from the dead and prepped for revenge, it leads Nick Morton and Jennifer Halsey through London in an attempt to have Set, the Egyptian god of death, possess Nick's body and destroy the world.
I'm not exactly sure what my expectations were supposed to be when I first heard about this movie. It's meant to be the start of Universal's brand new cinematic universe, simply titled The Dark Universe. Dracula Untold was meant to be the first entry in this franchise, but after its mediocre yet at the same time successful run of the box office, they made it non-canon. I don't know why they thought this movie would be the better franchise starter, but I guess its $407.8 million global take is enough for them to push forward. I just wish they made a better movie. Don't be fooled, this is not the overbloated CGI fest that the trailers want you to believe. Despite having a massive $125 million budget, the movie has very few moments of wanton destruction. In fact, the chase scene in London does nothing more than break every window in Westminster and flip over a double-decker bus. The filmmakers were certainly a lot more confident in the Dark Universe with this movie than they were with Dracula Untold, as they dedicate a large amount of the runtime to setting up Protogeum, which will most likely act as the shield of the universe. Of course, it wouldn't be a Tom Cruise movie without him doing his own stunts, and he does quite a few. I think part of what made him sign on was the amount of action sequences in which he runs, tumbles, falls, and ultimately gets his ass whooped. If only the sequences were as fun as Tom Cruise made them out to be. The action is generic. The mummy shows up, Tom gets knocked around a bit, there's a chase scene here or there. It's so bland and boring, you could have put those scenes in a movie like X-Men Apocalypse or Independence Day Resurgence, and you probably wouldn't know the difference. Now, while I do praise this movie for being more confident in its world building, it tries to give you everything at once. But the thing is, if we're giving all the information in the first movie, then what else is there for us to learn? Keep in mind, Bride of Frankenstein, the next movie in the Dark Universe, doesn't come out until February of 2019. They do try to write in some funny lines to relieve the tension, but none of the jokes land, and it just feels as if the writers were throwing everything at the wall and hoping something sticks. Also, and this is perhaps the biggest cardinal sin that this movie commits. Are you ready? Tom Cruise doesn't do enough running! I like the idea of bringing back monster movies because, in a way, they're kind of like westerns. They were insanely popular at one point, but now they are bygone era. I do think it's great that Universal is trying to breathe new life into these properties that they've had for almost a century now. But if you're going to compete with the MCU, the DCEU, and the MonsterVerse, at least try to make it your own unique style. Make it scary, but if you want to add action, don't overplay it. Keep the budget small, but tell big stories. We already have a roster of stars for this franchise, but that doesn't mean squat if you don't put any brains into the filmmaking process. I do think there is strong potential for the Dark Universe to work, it just needs the right people behind it. I don't mean actors, I'm talking writers and directors. The Mummy starring Brendan Fraser is a fun and campy adventure, but The Mummy starring Tom Cruise is a generic action flick that's trying way too hard to start off a cinematic universe. If you want to dig up this undead mess for yourself, then check it out once it hits Netflix. Hey there guys, how are you? It's me, the Canadian Movie Buff, with a review of Wonder Woman. No, wait, hang on, let me say that again. Wonder Woman! Alright, my voice can't go that high. It's an origin story about Princess Diana, who grew up on the island of Themyscira. I hope I pronounced that right. It's an island that's hidden from the rest of the world, and you have this civilization that's built around being preparing to fight Ares, the god of war. When Steve Trevor, a pilot from the outside world, comes crashing onto the island and they learn of this world war, Diana suspects that Ares is behind this, and goes off into the world to confront him and end the war. I think I speak for everyone when I say that Wonder Woman was a huge redeeming quality of Batman v Superman. The theme song alone got everybody hyped up. I can't remember how it goes. Now that she has a movie of her own, how is it? It's pretty good. It's great actually. But, as what has become the battle cry of the DCEU fandom, don't believe the Rotten Tomatoes score. Origin stories are pretty much the standard for first-time superhero movies, and as far as this one goes, it was handled extremely well. It doesn't feel like we're just being introduced to this character, but it feels like her own adventure. Then again, that's most origin stories in a nutshell, but this one feels a little bit special. I was a little worried we were going to be overstaying our welcome on the island, and the World War I stuff was just going to be skimmed over. Nope, we spent just the right amount of time at each location. It dives deep into the horrors of war and how that shaped Diana as a character. And big thing that I want to get out of the way, the plot is pretty easy to follow. As much as I liked Batman v Superman, I will admit I had a hard time making heads or tails of it. But since we're only dealing with one superhero inside an already established universe, the writers were able to fine-tune the story's focus and give us an enjoyable movie with a plot that made sense. Now I don't know what it is with the DCEU, but they seem to have perfect casting. Gal Gadot knocks it out of the park as the Amazon warrior, bringing a sense of fearlessness, discovery, and selflessness all wrapped under the banner of classic heroism. Wait, why does that sound familiar? Chris Pine does a solid job as Steve Trevor, the pilot that Wonder Woman falls in love with. What I liked about the love story was that they made it progress naturally and it didn't feel forced at all. Plus, it happened in the comics, so adaptation win. They flip the script on the whole damsel in distress thing, but they don't make Steve a helpless doof who doesn't know how to get himself out of trouble. It doesn't feel like Wonder Woman is trying to save Steve, but rather Steve and Diana are working together. A dynamic duo, if you will. For the most part, there aren't too many special effects. Or at least not too many special effects that are glaringly obvious. When it is used, it's to flip over a tank or destroy a building or put that glowy effect on Wonder Woman's lasso of truth. But when the third act came around, they realized they had underused their budget, so they dumped what was left into the last 20 minutes to create a CGI fest very reminiscent of the Doomsday fight. Come on guys, really? You pretty much turned the final battle with the villain into a boss fight from a video game. And yeah, I will admit, this movie did echo elements of Captain America: The First Avenger. A soldier who wants to do the right thing, fights in a world war where it's revealed that a high-ranking German officer is the hero's arch-nemesis, and then they have an epic battle filled with special effects. But you'd think I was a sexist for calling that out, wouldn't you? If Batman and Superman let you down, Wonder Woman atones for those sins with a well-structured plot, some awesome action sequences, and strong performances from Gadot and Pine. The third act ruined it for me a bit, but it's still worth checking out, and definitely worth watching multiple times whether it's at the theater or on Blu-ray. This time around, Optimus has gone into space looking for his creator while Kid Yeager and the Autobots go on the run for some reason. They discover an ancient Transformer and learn of the Cybertronian Knights and that they need to find the last one to save the world. You know how with the old Star Trek movies, the odd number ones are bad and the even number ones are good? That's kind of the reverse with Transformers. The first and third got the best critical reception, but the second and fourth got the beatdown. Despite my hopes for this movie, I did keep my expectations in check. The fifth movie plays a big part in the future of a franchise. It either kills it or revives it. Here's the thing though, when you make your worst movie early into said franchise's life, you can't really go much lower than that. And boy does this movie go low. First things first. Aaron Kruger, the guy who wrote the second, third, and fourth movies, he's out of there. Probably because he was too busy writing the live-action Ghost in the Shell. Now we got different writers, and you can tell right away that they're a bit more polished in their craft than Kruger. But then again, with credits like Iron Man and Black Hawk Down, you gotta expect something good to come out of it. They somehow managed to get Anthony Hopkins to star in this, and you can tell right from the first scene that he loved every second of making this movie. He may not have the best lines, but he gives it 110% in his performance. We also have the return of Josh Duhamel and Tyrese Gibson, and unlike another movie that promised the return of cast members from the original trilogy but did nothing with them, they team up with Wahlberg to take on the Decepticons. For a movie called Transformers, there sure wasn't a lot of them. In fact, they're barely in this movie at all. A lot of the focus was on the humans and their attempt to save Earth. Again, listen, there's a reason why these movies are so popular. We go to see robots beat the living crap out of each other. We don't care about the humans and their attempt to save the world. Pick and choose a dozen movies and I guarantee you they'll have the exact same plot of humans trying to save the planet from the apocalypse. The action isn't even that interesting. I was bored. That is the one positive thing that's consistent with these movies. The action always kept me entertained in some shape or form. Even with Revenge of the Fallen, there were one or two scenes that I liked and even remember. Here, I've got nothing. Every memorable action moment was shown in the trailer, so when you see it in the movie, it has no impact. I guess Peter Cullen was sick of Michael Bay's shtick because Optimus Prime's total screen time is around 20 minutes, if that. He probably looked at the script and was like, "F that, I've had it up to here with these dumb movies." If I have to give one movie the title of biggest disappointment, it would have to be The Last Knight. I thought this was going to be a turning point for the Transformers franchise the same way Fast 5 reinvigorated the Fast and Furious movies. Although to be fair, that series is running out of gas pretty quickly. No pun intended. It's not terrible enough for Netflix, but good enough to spend $5 and seeing it at the cheap seats. There's this kid named Jake Chambers who has this special ability where he can sort of see into this alternate dimension called Midworld. He has visions of two people, the Gunslinger and the Man in Black. Turns out his visions are real, and that the Man in Black is trying to destroy this pillar that holds the universe together. This pillar is called, well, you guessed it, the Dark Tower. Jake crosses over to Midworld and decides to convince Roland, the last surviving gunslinger, to pick up his quest of defending the Dark Tower. Because if the tower falls, then the universe is pretty much doomed. I have not read the source material, so I walked into this movie not really knowing what to expect. Mostly, I just wanted an entertaining fantasy movie that gave a peek into a world that was familiar to some but strange to others. All it really did was turn people off from seeing it and created a divide amongst fans of the books. It goes without saying that Idris Elba and Matthew McConaughey are good actors, so it's no surprise to say that they're the best parts about this movie. Elba plays Roland the Gunslinger, and McConaughey plays Walter the Man in Black. Walter sort of views their relationship the same way the Joker views his relationship with Batman. He wants to play this little game with Roland forever, and that killing him will take away a small part of who he is. That, and also Roland is immune to his magic, so he couldn't really kill him if he tried. There was that element of universe building, but it never really tried to shove it down your throats. Not like some movies. This movie had the exact same problem as The Mummy. Great potential, but sloppy execution. It had an interesting idea, but the people who handled it had no idea what to do. It felt as if they were trying too hard to maximize the movie's appeal without portraying the elements of the source material. Again, haven't read the books, but I'm going to come out on a limb here and say that this is an awful representation. This movie is littered with odd editing choices. Granted, it's not as bad as All Eyes on Me, but still, the way they cut it makes it feel as if there were scenes missing. Think back to Warcraft. You notice these jumps in time and think, wait a minute, shouldn't there be a scene in there somewhere? If the movie did cut out scenes for time, I don't know why. The movie's only an hour and 35 minutes, including opening logos and closing credits. So if we cut those out, that's only about 87 minutes of Dark Tower. That's not a movie, that's an extended episode of Game of Thrones. By the way, if you thought the movie looked good based on the trailer, well then, you've pretty much seen all the best parts. Not even kidding, go back and watch it. Or don't, because it reveals everything. We're talking Spider-Man Homecoming level of trailer spoilage. Considering how long this project was stuck in development hell, something at least passable should have came out of it. Instead, we get Heimdall battling his way through not one of the 9 realms, in hopes that Ragnarok won't look like a mess. McConaughey, on the other hand, should find a new agent before his merit as an Oscar winner fades away. The Dark Tower is a boring, sloppily edited movie with a poorly written script and performances that Elba and McConaughey could have done half asleep. Hopefully the upcoming TV series will give fans what they want, and hopefully attract more people to the Dark Tower fantasy book series. In the meantime, The Dark Tower can stand perfectly still on Netflix. Alright, Stephen King adaptations, this one failed. But, can this redeem that? Based on the book of the same name, I've probably used that phrase more often in my reviews this year than I ought to, it follows a group of preteens who call themselves the Losers Club. What they have in common is that they're all being haunted by a sinister-looking clown called Pennywise, and they discover that this creature is something that has existed for thousands of years. Wanting to fight back, they prepare to head down into the sewers of Derry, Maine to kill the clown once and for all. Perhaps the second most used phrase in my reviews this year, I have not read the source material. I get it, Hollywood, you want me to read more books, but I'm working on it. See? Having seen the 1990 miniseries, I was interested in seeing what they would do differently. With the focus primarily on the kids, a 2-hour and 50-minute runtime, a straight-up classic horror tale, and a 14A rating, R in the US, this Killer Clown tale will go down as one of the best adaptations of a Stephen King property. Warner Brothers is on fire with having child actors in their horror movies. First the Conjuring movies, then Annabelle Creation, and now this? Looks like Disney isn't the only way for child actors to get their start. The entire cast was amazing. Now these aren't the squeaky clean characters you would see in Diary of a Wimpy Kid or some other movie. As soon as their parents are no longer in sight, they're dropping F-bombs and telling dirty jokes. Basically how junior high / middle school students act in real life. They had so many awesome lines, probably some of the most memorable of the year. I can't remember any of the top of the head right now, but once I see it again, I'll be like, hey, that was a really good line. It's not like they were buddy pals to begin with. It actually shows how they meet and form the Losers Club, and it never feels rushed or as if they met by plot convenience. Okay, admittedly, there was a smidge of plot convenience. You know, just a little. There were also some genuine thrills in this movie without an over-reliance on jump scares. It drew you in with its cinematography and high-strung music and slowly unraveled the scare right before you. Surprisingly, there were a lot of Dutch tilts, a type of shot that you don't really see in movies nowadays. For those of you who don't know, a Dutch tilt is an overhead shot that's slightly off balance to give it that uneasy feeling. This movie is also a hell of a lot darker and violent than the miniseries. In fact, you actually get to see Georgie's arm bitten off, something that was graphically described in the book. Or at least I heard was graphically described in the book. Now that doesn't count as a spoiler because everybody and their mother knows that he was going to die. Even if you haven't seen the miniseries or the book, if you've seen the trailer, then you will know that Georgie's death is a major plot point in the movie. And as much as I like Tim Curry's performance, Bill Skarsgård is a much scarier Pennywise. But then again, there are two different adaptations. Curry was more cheesy and comedic, whereas Skarsgård was more sinister and menacing. It's kind of like comparing each actor who plays the Joker. For some people, there will always be that one definitive Joker, but that doesn't mean that the other versions are bad. There's nothing wrong with looking at one particular version and saying that's the best, because it's different for everybody. Who knows, if they do a remake 27 years down the line, then that version of Pennywise in that movie will be completely different from Skarsgård and Curry. And just listen to their voices and you can tell that they were meant to be different.
Hi, Georgie.
Hiya, Georgie.
I, Georgie, am Pennywise the Dancing Clown.
I'm Pennywise the Dancing Clown.
You are Georgie. So now we know each other.
Now we aren't strangers, are we?
There were some jokes here and there and a couple lighthearted moments, but it never really took me out of the movie. It was just some levity to add to the movie to give it a bit of a balance. It gives the audience a chance to breathe and let their guard down before gotcha! Even though he was a crucial member of the Losers Club, I felt as if Mike was an underdeveloped character. According to the miniseries, and from what I've heard in the book, he's the only one to stay in Derry after they defeat Pennywise, and he eventually becomes a cop, and when Pennywise returns 27 years later, he's the one who calls him up and says, hey, clown's back, we gotta go kill it again. I spoke in a really bad Boston accent for that part, I don't know why. Point is, when chapter 2 starts off, he's going to be the first face we see, and people more likely going to be, who are you again? The final act had a lot of shaky cam and jump cuts. Like the director thought that high tension means barely being able to see what's going on. I was down in front, so when you see everything jumbled together, you're just sitting there like... I honestly think that the time freeze battle sequence from King Arthur Legend of the Sword had better cinematography. It is making a lot of money right now, and for good reason. It's a fantastic movie. The scary parts were terrifying, the child actors were great, the cinematography was amazing, the soundtrack was excellent, and the plot never rushed or dragged. It's not just a great horror movie, it's a great movie, period. When all is said and done, The Tale of Pennywise makes for an awesome movie that is a total incrediblast.
So what happens now?
You know what happens now. You're quickly becoming a legend.
You may not know who Guy Ritchie is, but you definitely know his work. The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Snatch, the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes movies, Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels, and the upcoming live-action remake of Aladdin. Having seen the movie, I have to ask, what was it that people didn't like?
This movie has created a divide amongst audiences and critics, the likes of which we have not seen since Batman v Superman. I have to give credit to the performances. Charlie Hunnam does an impressive job as a street-level Arthur, and Jude Law is intimidating as Vortigern. And Neil Mescal, Aidan Gilligan, Ben Kingsley Ben-Adir, and Isman Hussein all round out the supporting cast as strong characters that are more than just comic relief. As these future Knights of the Round Table go on this journey with Arthur, the interaction between them feels very natural. This take of the King Arthur legend is very different than the story we know. This Arthur grew up in the streets, learning to fend for himself and make money whenever and wherever he could. He's the last guy you expect to be the true King of England. He looks more like a guy who fell asleep in the gutter after walking home from the pub. Another spin they do is that they have the villain force every man in the kingdom to try and pull the sword out of the stone. Here's the thing, there's a rebellion being plotted against Vortigern. He figures that if he can find the true King of England, he can make an example of him. Whoever the king may be, he wants to put him on a pedestal and say, this is your figurehead right here, and oh, there goes his head. So yeah, maybe want to think twice before you start a rebellion against me, huh? Guy Ritchie is a director who knows that his job is also in the editing room. By blending long shots, whip pans, and quick zooms with slick transitions, and having the occasional scene that doesn't go from point A to point B, he makes even the most mundane conversations fun to look at. In a way, he's sort of the poor man's Edgar Wright. If you've seen his movies, you know that he likes to reveal information through flashbacks. But the way he fits it into the scene feels natural. It's not like, okay, we're in this conversation, bam, here's a flashback. It's always, okay, here's how the conversation is going to go. Now we're going to cut here. Now we're just going to come back over here and then come over there and then come back over here. The entire scene runs smoothly and never compromises the moment. While most of the actors did a good job, I was seriously annoyed with Astrid Burgess Frisbee as the mage. That's it, she's just the mage. No character name, just the mage. She's allegedly an apprentice of Merlin, who the writers thought would be better off out of the script. Probably because he's stuck in an alternate timeline where he's asking Transformers for help. Burgess Frisbee sounded boring, stoic, and just uninterested. It felt as if she was there just to get a paycheck and maybe a career boost rather than actually diving into the character and trying to give an amazing performance. This may be a little bit harsh, but I think we found an actress worse than Cara Delevingne. And that's saying something. Now, English isn't exactly her first language, so it's entirely possible that this was her first English role, but when looking at other actors who've learned English as a second language and have done well for themselves, it sounds like a pitiful excuse. Don't believe that there are successful actors who've learned English as a second language? Well, then just ask Marion Cotillard, Mila Kunis, Andy Garcia, Penelope Cruz, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Christoph Waltz, and a previously mentioned actor who does a much better job, Dieter von Husum. Much like Wonder Woman, the third act of this movie gets a little crazy. There's a scene where Arthur is just cutting down soldiers left, right, and center, but it's so fast-paced that I can't even make out what's going on. It's like zoom, wah, 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 wah. If you played any RPG video game, you know what I'm talking about. King Arthur Legend of the Sword may not have won the box office, but it's certainly winning fans. Give this movie a few years and it may have a real cult following. In fact, it probably already has. A lot of Guy Ritchie's movies tend to have that feel. Except for the RDJ Sherlock Holmes movies, those are already beloved by many. It's weird when you stop to think about it. Guy Ritchie has had mainstream success before. How is it possible for him to take a character that's been adapted countless times and turn it into a billion-dollar franchise, but fail to make that same magic work for other revamped versions of previously existing material? Why is it he's able to get Comic-Con promotion, but still barely turn out a profit? Maybe he just got lucky that RDJ was becoming one of the biggest names in Hollywood, thanks to the MCU, and that's what propelled the movies to success. Maybe Charlie Hunnam doesn't have the same appeal as Robert Downey does. Or maybe people just weren't interested in another King Arthur movie. Whatever the case, it doesn't take away from the fact that this movie is thoroughly enjoyable. The action was fast-paced, but didn't become too distracting. The effects were cool, the acting was great, the comedy, although unexpected, flowed naturally. This take on the old tale was very unique in its style and substance. The only things I didn't like were the mage and that weird time freeze battle in the castle near the end. You should check it out as soon as possible because King Arthur Legend of the Sword is definitely worth watching multiple times, whether it's at the theater or on Blu-ray. May not look like much, but it's home. Blade Runner, a movie with a cult following that after 35 years managed to get a sequel. Does it hold up, or is it Hollywood trying to cash in on another beloved property? The future is here, so let's jump right into the review. The first thought that comes to mind is, of course, we've officially run out of movie ideas. Another thought is, how did this movie come into fruition in the first place? Sure, the original is a classic and loved by many, but it took years to get its fans. Then it got about 3 different recuts so that everybody would love it. Something I wish Ridley Scott would do for Alien Covenant. But, to everybody's surprise, 2049 is an excellent film. Not only does it match up toe-to-toe with the original movie, but it also stands as its own sci-fi tale. With a beautiful blend of cinematography, design, and music, matched with a gripping story and some solid acting, the latest flick from Denis Villeneuve is truly a work of art. Ryan Gosling nails the part of Joe, a Blade Runner who's tasked with hunting down the older models of replicants and retiring them. If you catch my drift. He does so little in terms of facial movement or emotion, but when you see how he reacts to the world around him, it speaks volume to how he's feeling inside. Given that this is a Ridley Scott produced movie, you've got to expect some sort of underlying theme. For me, that theme was humanity. What is it that makes us human? How do we find it, or can we find it? This movie gets the wheels in your head turning in the way that you think about your own life. It sounds depressing at first, but it's really touching and almost poetic. Is Joe just a machine, or can he be human? There's this really good exchange that comes between Robin Wright and Ryan Gosling. They're talking about having a soul, and Robin Wright says, "You've done well enough with that one." And Ryan Gosling asks, "Without what?" And she says, "A soul?" It's those moments that stick with you long after you leave the theater. As we go on this journey with Joe, the cinematography and the design really captivate you and bring you into this cyberpunk world where life isn't easy and there are people that are just trying to survive. The music is very reminiscent of the original movie, but they don't play for nostalgia's sake. At some points, it feels as if the music itself is a part of that dreary world that Joe lives his day-to-day in. And for 3 hours, I felt as if I was a part of that world. Robin Wright had a strong supporting role as Joe's boss, and that really brought out the power figure in her. Her body language speaks command, and her voice had an undertone of control. The plot was carefully crafted. They gave you bits and pieces and clues to make you think you had all the answers, but then that's when they start throwing shades of doubt. Is this just all one big dupe, or are we discovering something real? Then, of course, there's the unexpected twist. This is one of those movies where if you watch it multiple times, you'll pick up all the hints. And that's why I love this movie so much. I tried to guess how the movie may go, but then I had the script completely turn on me. Clever move, movie. Clever move. By the way, I don't know what's going on with Jared Leto, but he seems to be getting a lot of acting jobs that don't require him to be in the movie for very long. We see him for an extended amount of time, and the scene he's in is absolutely mesmerizing, but then he just disappears. Although he does an amazing job returning as Rick Deckard, Harrison Ford isn't in the movie that much. Now that does play a role in the plot. He's been in hiding for some time. But the way he was played up in the trailers made him seem as if he was going to get a significant amount of screen time. The dialogue and the pacing can be a little clunky. There were a couple moments where the mood felt off and there was a disruption in how things were flowing. In one scene you have Deckard and Joe fighting and Joe is just getting his face absolutely beat in. Then as soon as an Elvis Presley song comes on, Deckard stops and says, "I like this song. You want to get a drink?" I don't speak from experience, but I'm pretty sure nobody drops a fight with a stranger just because their favorite song came on the jukebox. In an age of remakes, sequels, and franchises, it's nice to know that a movie that falls into one of these categories can be more than just average. This sequel, logically speaking, shouldn't exist. After all, how do you follow up a masterpiece with anything just as good? It takes time, dedication, integrity, a little luck, and a dash of faith in the people behind the making of the movie. Blade Runner 2049 is a masterpiece, and I mean that in every sense of the word. The design, the retro synthesizing music, the camera work that doesn't shy away, the plot that always has you guessing, the themes that make you think. It absolutely deserves to be called one of the best movies of the year. It is, without a doubt in my mind, a total incrediblast.
Ansel Elgort plays Baby. Yeah, that's his real name. He's the getaway driver for bank heists and always has music playing in his ears because of an accident he was in as a kid. But because of that, he's the best driver around. One day, he goes into a diner and falls in love with a waitress. They plan to run off together, but before they can do that, Baby has to do one last job. Edgar Wright has never failed to deliver a movie with comedic overtones, impressive visuals, action-driven plots, and interesting characters. Although his previous projects didn't really catch the public's eye, it's nice to see that he's getting the recognition he deserves. At least, box office-wise. He's always been a favorite with critics. What makes this movie so awesome is that the action and the music are always in tune with each other. Every gunshot, door slam, police siren, tire screech, it's all in sync with the music. There's even an entire segment early in the movie where he's going off to get coffee and every little thing that's happening on screen has the music playing over it and it matches absolutely perfectly. It's just... By the way, if you thought that Guardians of the Galaxy had an awesome soundtrack, just wait until you see this movie. Edgar Wright brings a mix of classic pop and rock and always matches a song with the right scene. Director Wright also steps out a little bit outside his comfort zone and throws in a bit more of a dramatic edge. His movies are usually straight up comedies, but this one felt a bit more serious than his previous works. He also really knows how to frame a shot. Throughout this movie, you can see that his way with cinematography usually involves long tracking shots, extreme close-ups, and long shots that give the action plenty of room to play out. Elgort is outstanding in this movie as the young man who wants out of this life but knows he can't run away. He has great chemistry with Lily James, and the way their characters are written make them appear like two normal young adults who are stuck in this web of criminality. Kevin Spacey, John Hamm, Isa Gonzalez, and Jamie Foxx all round out the cast as unique, developed characters with their own motivations and traits. Spacey plays the typical calm yet intimidating mobster, Hamm and Gonzalez play a Bonnie and Clyde type duo, and Foxx plays the office rocker trigger-happy Bats. When you watch a lot of movies where they have bank robbing crew as the premise, you notice that they tend to follow a similar pattern. And unfortunately, Baby Driver succumbs to that narrative. This is what I call the three heist narrative, and this is how it goes. The first heist, we're introduced to the characters, the robbery goes smoothly, this is another typical job for them. Nothing really special happens here other than to set the stage. The second heist, something doesn't quite go right. The crew are forced to improvise from their original plan, and it's revealed that the protagonist may have a secret. The third heist, that's when everything goes wrong. They don't get away with the money, there's a shootout with the police, and the protagonist either ends up behind bars or on the run. This is a movie where the style and the characters are the biggest selling points. It's a little bit of a nitpick, but John Bernthal isn't really in the movie that much. He shows up in the beginning and then he just disappears. Granted, he was probably busy filming The Punisher, but what bothered me is that you could have anyone play his character, and yet Sony decided to use his name as a selling point. That's what I kind of hate about movies, when they try to use big names to sell the movie rather than the style or the acting or the cinematography or anything. Just like Gravity did with George Clooney. As it stands, Baby Driver has grossed $224 million worldwide with $107 million coming out of North America, and considering that the budget is $34 million, that's a pretty big success. But I'm hoping that people recognize Edgar Wright for his artistic vision rather than the ability to bring in box office numbers. Granted, he was given the opportunity to work on Ant-Man, but he backed out over creative differences. When you factor in the perfectly coordinated musical action sequences, the strong lead performances, the balanced comedic and dramatic elements, and the visuals, you've got yourself an entertaining movie that's definitely worth repeat viewings. So I will say that Baby Driver is a total incrediblast.
It's very American.
Yeah, it is.
Manners. maketh man.
Do you know what that means?
They say that when you review a Kingsman movie, you should dress up. But I'm going to take this tie off because it doesn't go with the shirt, it's choking me horribly, and it's blocking the mic, so... And here's a little bit of trivia. According to director Matthew Vaughn, Colin Firth was not meant to be in any of the trailers. So, with that out of the way, let's jump in. Taking place 1 year after Eggsy joined the Kingsmen, everybody from the Secret Service has been wiped out, leaving Eggsy and Merlin as the two sole survivors. Turns out there's this kingpin named Poppy who runs a drug syndicate known as the Golden Circle. Her plan is to have every drug in the world legalized and for her to get special immunity. And if that doesn't happen, she won't release the antidote for a blue rash virus that's being spread among those who use illegal substances. Eggsy and Merlin follow the Doomsday Protocol and end up in Kentucky, where they meet their American cousins, the Statesmen. I've come to accept that it's hard to make a sequel to a smash hit. Avengers, Guardians of the Galaxy, Spider-Man. When you make something so unique and perfect, people will want to relive that experience in a fresh yet familiar setting. But just like Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, Kingsman: The Golden Circle falls into the pit of sequels that don't really live up to the original. Not so much disappointing, just meh. When it comes to Matthew Vaughn, you can expect two things: raunchy comedy that's not usually found in the genre he associates it with, and long-take action sequences. There are several action scenes in this movie that are shot and edited to make it look like one continuous take. You might be able to notice a cut if you look very closely, but because it's so seamless, you have to be paying really close attention. The Statesmen were a big addition to this world of independent spy agencies, and it was handled carefully and crafted to be exactly what you hope they'd be: the American Kingsmen. Except instead of Knights of the Round Table, they're named after alcohol. Each member of the American Kingsmen really shone through. Pedro Pascal as Agent Whiskey, Channing Tatum as Agent Tequila, Jeff Bridges as Champagne, and Halle Berry as Ginger Ale. Okay, was Matthew Vaughn just going through his alcohol cabinet when he was writing the script? Eggsy has also grown into a completely new character. When we last left him off, he's had some room to grow and fully develop, and within the first 20 minutes, you get to see this new Eggsy in action. I will admit I was dubious of how they were going to top Samuel Jackson playing a global warming extremist, but it turns out it's quite simple. Make Julianne Moore the head of the most dangerous drug cartel in the world. Her performance as Poppy kinda has that snake oil salesman charm to it. You don't really know her evil side until you sucker it in. And judging by the theme of these villains, Kingsman 3 is going to have some loopy animal rights activist played by Dwayne Johnson or Meryl Streep. Dwayne Johnson takes over the world, coming in 2020. Okay, I don't know who Hollywood is hiring to make their trailers, but they need to be fired. According to Matthew Vaughn, Harry Hart's review of Being Still Alive was actually not meant to be in the trailers. It was going to be the big surprise at the end of the first act. But because marketing, we got a big spoiler on our hands. I won't go into too much detail so you can have some small element of surprise. I think I speak for all of us when I say that the church fight scene is one of the most awesome action sequences to come out of Hollywood in recent years. Point is, that scene just made the entire movie. Matthew Vaughn kind of played a little bit safe this time around, and the final fight scene is the craziest out of the bunch, but it's not really that over the top. It's a case of original versus sequel. You can't expect the follow-up to be just as good as the original. Also, the movie kind of dragged in the middle. I feel like you could have cut out one or two scenes here and there. Not even just that much of an entire scene, but maybe one or two moments. I totally get the pressure that Matthew Vaughn was facing. With Kingsman: The Secret Service, he delivered an R-rated comic book adventure that let producers see Valentine's Day as a potential weekend for action movies. He pretty much started the crusade on keeping people away from the 50 Shades of Grey movies. We were excited for the potential this world had, with its clever and crude humor,
balls to the walls action scenes and outlandish villains straight out of classic James Bond movies. Kingsman: The Golden Circle still retains a lot of what made the original good, with its mind-blowing action, its genre-defying humor, and its crazy villains. The only thing that was lacking was that spark that made us fall in love with the original. The jokes don't always stick, and the action isn't that over the top. Plus, the trailers that spoiled a whole chunk of it didn't really help either. If you liked the first one, then definitely go check this movie out. Although keep in mind you might not like it as much. For what it's worth, Kingsman: The Golden Circle is definitely worth seeing at least once in theaters. Don't swing for IMAX though. Not worth it. Picking up a few months after dawn, Caesar and his tribe of apes are at a stalemate in their fight against the humans. He's more than happy to talk peace, but the colonel doesn't see eye to eye on that. After a failed assassination attempt, Caesar decides to track down the colonel and put an end to the war the way the humans want him to. The Planet of the Apes prequel trilogy is probably one of the best franchises to come out of Hollywood in recent memory, and the fact that there's a substantial amount of people who come out to support these movies just warms my heart. It just goes to show, no matter how strange a concept, if the movie is good, people will come. There's this sequence that shows a typical skirmish between the apes and the humans, and it's probably one of the best shot action scenes I've seen in a movie this year. There's this top-down shot as it flies over the battlefield and you see apes and humans killing each other. It's beautiful and disturbing at the same time. Now the effects of this trilogy are nothing short of amazing, and Andy Serkis' performance is outstanding. Each facial movement translates so well onto the screen that I forget it's just him wearing green dots with two cameras sticking out. His feud with the Colonel eventually leads him on a revenge quest because of something that happened in the movie that I'll keep quiet about here. The theme of vengeance plays a big part in this movie. We watch Caesar go on this journey through this world that the war has created. So much so that it sets up the original film perfectly, albeit a little bit differently, as in the original it was nuclear war, whereas in this timeline it's the simian flu, which is now deadlier than ever because those who were initially genetically immune to it are now de-evolving into their primal ways. That means loss of speech, animalistic behavior, and limited intelligence. If you were wondering why the apes were shocked that Charles Heston could speak in the original movie, there's your answer. Those apes live in a society where humans being dumb and speechless has become the norm. For a movie with the word war in the title, there wasn't a whole lot of fighting going on. Really bummed me out. I really wanted another dual-wielding machine gun ape on horseback riding through fire moment. Near the end, right when you think there's going to be this huge final standoff, it kinda just throws in a plot convenience just to make the movie end quicker. If they had called this something else other than war, then I may not be so cynical. I'm kinda sad this came out right between Dunkirk and Spider-Man Homecoming because this movie deserves a lot more box office attention. I mean, if we talk worldwide gross, it's doing fairly well, but it's making nowhere near the amount of money it deserves. But, as it's been proven time and time again, money doesn't tell you whether your movie's good or bad. I mean, just look at King Arthur. When you boil it all down, War for the Planet of the Apes is one of the best movies of the year. The acting, the story, the incredible effects, the themes of vengeance and peace and family, it all comes down to a movie that is a total incrediblast.
Too? Yeah, stole his shield.
Tom Holland reprises the role we all saw in Civil War, and Michael Keaton continues his trend of birth-themed characters as Adrian Toomes, aka the Vulture. Toomes has been selling weapons made from Chitauri armor ever since Tony Stark ran him out of the scavenging business several years ago. But now he's done hiding and is ready to strike the Avengers and take their weaponry, and only Peter Parker can stop him. But can he get a date for the homecoming dance? I figured everybody was getting tired of Spider-Man movies. I mean, if you stop to think about it, we've had 3 different actors play him over the course of a decade. Don't you think it might be time to put him on the shelf for a bit? Although Tom Holland brings his A-game and Marvel delivers another solid flick, it's Michael Keaton who steals the show. I don't know about anybody else, but I would have preferred if Tom Holland had not shown up in Civil War. That being said, he gives it his all in this movie, channeling that awkward high school persona that we all had at some point in our lives. He's still learning how to be a hero, and that doesn't come without consequence. He doesn't have Tony Stark there to hold his hand, so he has to make decisions based on his own instinct. Michael Keaton nails this role. There are moments when he just says something and you know this guy means serious business. His entire life is stacked on a house of cards, and he's not going to let some human arachnid get in the way. That's what made this movie stand out to me. It dodged the MCU villain problem that's been plaguing the franchise for years. And like most Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, there were some awesome moments and great lines. Whenever there was an action sequence, the danger felt real. That very scene is the moment when Peter Parker realizes, can he save everyone? Even though Tony Stark bails him out in the end, he looks back and says, can I manage this life of being a superhero knowing that I may not be able to save everybody? All the action was in the trailer. Just going to tell you that now. There were some hidden gems here and there, but all the Spider-Man vs. Vulture action was in the marketing. Plus, they kind of pulled Jared Leto with Michael Keaton. For those of you who don't know, pulling a Jared Leto means having an actor on screen for a very short time, despite how much they're played up in the marketing. This phrase originates from the lack of screen time the Joker had in Suicide Squad. But if it's any consolation, Marvel and Sony clearly knew what they were doing when they cast Michael Keaton as Adrian Toomes. Spider-Man Homecoming is an enjoyable superhero movie. It's nothing mind-blowingly spectacular, it's just there to do its job. Introduce Spider-Man to the MCU. It does its job well, but it's more or less par for the course. Again, probably would have enjoyed it a bit more had we not had that 20-minute cameo of Spider-Man in Civil War, or if the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man movies just didn't happen. Regardless, this is another perfectly fun entry in the MCU, and it doesn't really try too hard to establish itself in the universe. So for that, I will say you'll have a lot of fun giving Spider-Man Homecoming multiple viewings at the theater or on Blu-ray.
Now I know what you're thinking. How did this happen? Well, it's a long story.
So things aren't going quite well for Thor. For one thing, Hela, the goddess of death, has escaped from a prison and broke his hammer. He's been cast out onto an unknown planet, there's a surprise, and now has to make his way back home before Asgard gets wiped out. Also, he has to fight the Hulk now if he ever wants to get off the planet and escape the Grandmaster. With each standalone trilogy of the MCU, there's always one that stands above the rest. For the Iron Man trilogy, it was Iron Man 1. For the Captain America trilogy, it was The Winter Soldier. Since this would be the last film in the Thor trilogy, and considering how nobody was particularly won over by the first two, Marvel knew they had to do something really special to pull this one off. So they dug into Norse mythology and pulled out Ragnarok, the end of all things, and they turned it into a retro disco comedy. Much like Marvel's most recent projects, it has its moments and its problems. Thor Ragnarok suffers from the MCU's villain and sequel problems, and as well as the more recent problem of having too much humor, but that doesn't mean the movie itself isn't a good time. If there's one thing I can say about Marvel this year, it's that they're writing better villains. Right when Cate Blanchett appears on the screen, you know she means business. She enters through a black portal out in the middle of nowhere. I don't know about you, but that is one way to make an entrance. Right away, there was this creepy vibe around her that you knew that she was going to be worse than Loki. Not to mention that she's extremely powerful. After all, she did break Mjolnir. Also, the Hulk is back! Since Universal is pretty much barring Marvel Studios from making standalone movies, they need to use him every way they can. So it's refreshing to see him pop out outside of an Avengers movie. Now, I sometimes can't help but wonder, what would the MCU be if Edward Norton was Bruce Banner? I liked how Jeff Goldblum handled the Grandmaster. Even though he's been using the same style of acting for his entire career, it works with this character. He's the brother of Benicio del Toro's The Collector and runs a gladiator pit, so he has to have that sense of showmanship about him. Goldblum performs in his traditional Goldblum way, but that's what makes the character so great. If he played it up anymore, it would come across as cartoonish. Between the disco theme, the outlandish gladiator fights, and the demon monster, this movie had a little bit of that B-movie charm. You look at the demon guy, I forgot his name, you could tell that the CGI is a little bit unpolished, to say the least. The movie was so outlandish and weird that it was hard to take it seriously. And sometimes that worked, but other times it didn't. Thor is meant to be the fish out of water Avenger. He doesn't quite know how Earth works, how sarcasm works. He doesn't really understand our humor. But now he's been completely rewritten to be more hip and funny, as if to say, what Thor the Dark World? I don't know about no Thor the Dark World. That's the issue I've been having a lot with Marvel movies recently. Too much comedy. Don't be afraid to go dark, even if it gets you a 26% on Rotten Tomatoes. I remember when Kevin Feige dissolved the Marvel Committee, he said it would give more creative freedom to the writers and directors of the MCU. I think by creative freedom, he meant cookie cutter. Because that's what Thor Ragnarok is. The disco theme, the overuse of humor, the outlandish plot, it's pretty much Guardians of the Galaxy in a different skin. The movie also had serious tone issues. It didn't know whether to make you laugh, cry, or be shocked. There's about a 3 or 4 minute scene with Odin, Thor, and Loki, and then Hela shows up. At first it's a touching moment, then there's a joke that's made, then Hela shows up. 4 minutes you're like, oh, that's so emotional. Also, may I remind you that this is pretty much the apocalypse of Thor's side of the MCU. That's it, the whole 9 realms deal, that's shut off. Done. Boom. Here's what I imagine the process must have been. Okay, it's Ragnarok, the end of all things, the apocalypse. Let's make it a light retro disco comedy with the Hulk. I don't know whether they came up with the title first or the concept first, but they shouldn't have named this movie Ragnarok. As we wrap up 2017, I think it's safe to say that Marvel didn't really bring their A game. Homecoming, Guardians 2, Ragnarok, it feels as if they become too self-aware of what makes their movies work. In a previous review, I mentioned that Marvel seems to be trying way too hard to be recognized as the franchise with the humor. It's for that reason why Warner Brothers ordered Suicide Squad to be recut to be more funny, and why Justice League will have a lighter tone. Marvel has such a monopoly on the superhero business that it forgets that they can go dark. Marvel, you don't need to keep all the dark stuff to Netflix. You can bring those into the movies too. Not gonna lie, I'm disappointed in the road the MCU seems to be walking down. If you take one thing away from my review, it's this. Comedy does not make a good superhero movie. It makes for a good comedy. What matters in a superhero movie are the characters and the plot and how the source material is handled. Wow, I've really been ripping on this movie. But for all intents and purposes, I enjoyed it for what it was. I liked how Jeff Goldblum handled the Grandmaster, even though it's the same type of acting he did for Independence Day 2. The Thor vs. Hulk fight was cool. Cate Blanchett made for a good villain. It had some awesome set pieces. And when set in the right tone, the comedy worked. But it's not a bad way to spend a couple hours. And although it's not outstanding, you should definitely see it at least once in theaters. Ryan Reynolds plays a self-claimed AAA bodyguard who suckered into protecting Darius Kincaid, a hitman who has the only evidence that can bring down the president of Belarus. Played by Gary Oldman, of course. I have to credit whoever came up with this idea, because while it is formulaic on the surface, there's a certain charm to it. Although Reynolds and Jackson have strong performances and funny lines, it can't help but fall to action comedy cliches. Ryan Reynolds and Samuel Jackson have great chemistry, and every scene they're in just drives the movie up. They have that cliched, I don't like you, but we're gonna need each other to survive thing going, but for the most part, it works in their favor. Sometimes the jokes they make will refer back to something that was said earlier in the movie, and because you don't see it coming, it makes for a pleasant surprise. Now, because of the movie's plot, they have all the genre's archetypes, including the good guy that's secretly working with the villain trope. You just look at him and you're like, yep, he's evil. But what I liked was that they did try to pull the surprise villain at the end. You know, where an action movie tries to pull a twist and say that this seemingly good guy is actually working for the bad guys, even though you know that he was working for the bad guys. The movie decided to pull the wool over your eyes until it revealed itself later on. They revealed that he was a villain early in the movie and didn't try to lead you on this path. You hear that, Jason Bourne? Stop making your closet bad guys so easy to spot. Despite what this movie has going for it, not every joke lands on its feet. A lot of the comedy relies on that quippy, snappy back and forth, but that trend gets old soon enough. And whenever a joke didn't stick, it would create this awkward silence that made it kind of uncomfortable to watch. There's a scene when they're driving down the highway and Samuel Jackson starts singing. Ryan Reynolds tries to ignore him, but then joins in on a high note. It's funny when it happens, but the build-up felt confusing and the moment just went on longer than it had to. The storyline was fairly predictable. You had this odd couple who hated each other, but they eventually bond and soon it leads to a happy ending. So basically, if you've seen Rush Hour or the Jump Street movies, you've pretty much seen Hitman's Bodyguard, except this time it's with Ryan Reynolds and Samuel Jackson. This movie dominated the box office during the last couple weeks of the summer, but that's not really saying much, because once it came out, this movie faded from the top 10 lightning fast. It's an alright movie, there are some nice, if not generic, action sequences, and the chemistry between Jackson and Reynolds works, but I feel as if this movie should have been funnier based on premise alone. Maybe they should have had better writers. It's not that much of a memorable movie, but it's worth checking out at the cheap seats. Taking place in the 50s, long before she met the Warrens, Annabelle Creation takes place in the house of a former doll maker who opens his home to a local orphanage. Spooky shenanigans once they move in, and that's all I'm going to say without giving away the plot. I think everyone who saw the first Annabelle movie did a collective eye roll when they saw the trailer for this movie. And for good reason too, the first one sucked. However, this movie posed a Ouija origin of evil and gives us a solid flick that the first movie should have been. James Wan only served as producer for this movie, but his signature style of creepiness can be found all over the place. As you go through the film, you notice that something isn't quite right. The slow zooms and lack of music add to the atmosphere of an old house that hides away a powerful evil. David F. Sandberg sits in the director's chair for this movie, and if that name rings a bell, it may be because of Lights Out, both the 2013 short film and the 2016 feature film. As his second feature film and second collaboration with James Wan, David F. Sandberg is quickly shaping up to be one of the next big names in horror. There are a lot of child actors in the cast, and they give the performances of a lifetime in their roles. The biggest standout is easily Talitha Bateman as Janice. Her character suffers from polio, and since that makes her the most vulnerable, she is the main target of Annabelle's hauntings. Gotta hand it to her, she probably had to put up with a lot on set. I was also surprised at how well the dialogue was written, as nothing was forced and it moved the plot along at a steady pace. Alright, if nobody's going to say it, I will. This formula is getting repetitive, old, and stale really quickly. Every film in the Conjureverse has the exact same plot structure. People discover an evil spirit, it singles out the weakest one, it knocks over a bunch of stuff, nobody believes the victim, but eventually it starts messing with the other characters enough that they all believe the first victim. Here I was thinking that the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise was getting too repetitive. And although they are a staple of the franchise, there was a bit of an over-reliance on jump scares. Every 5 minutes there was something that popped out and jumped at you. Whenever there was a slow moment, they would add a bit of a jump scare just to get the adrenaline pumping. Although to be fair, as it enters the final act, there are so many jump scares coming one after the other that the jump aspect of the jump scare doesn't really scare you anymore. Don't get me wrong, the demon in this movie is scary as hell and is frightening throughout the entire movie. I don't consider myself a horror guy, but I do enjoy James Wan's work, and I like what Warner Brothers is doing with their Conjuring verse. However, that comes with the territory. You need to freshen it up with different directors and different styles to keep it from going stale. Look at Marvel, for example. Sure, they're pumping out millions upon millions of dollars with each entry, but they're all starting to run together. Very few of them stick out as their own creations of different writers, directors, and actors. Guardians of the Galaxy 2 is a good example of what happens when you stick to a formula too well. The next 2 spin-off movies are going to be The Crooked Man and The Nun, so maybe they'll do something different with those properties. Annabelle Creation may not be as good as the Conjuring movies, but it does improve as a prequel and a standalone entry. It's not a great movie, but it's passable enough to see it at least once in theaters. This comes from writer-director Luc Besson, who you may recognize for his work on Leon the Profession, The Fifth Element, Lucy, and the Taken trilogy. His latest movie is based around the graphic novel of a similar name, and is based around two special agents who travel around space, combating injustices wherever they find it. And that's pretty much the rundown of this movie. Luc Besson has an interesting career. His films range from modern classics to absolute garbage. His latest directorial project, Lucy, was a fun late summer watch, but Taken 3 was an unwanted mess. He's very hit and miss. You can never be sure whether to be excited for his movies, dread them, or let a coin flip decide whether or not you'll go buy a ticket. Let me tell you right now, you can give this movie a miss. For all the problems this movie had, the visuals were spectacular. In fact, considering everything else about this movie, the CGI is way better than it deserves to be. Every little detail felt real, and it built a vast world that connected all the alien species from across the universe. And that fills our quota, so let's move on to the next part. I don't know who's in charge of the casting process, but they should have been fired. Dane DeHaan plays Valerian, and Cara Delevingne plays Laureline. They're always on screen together, and they had terrible chemistry. Their romance ranks among the likes of Bella and Edward, where they think being dead inside means they're serious actors. Also, have you read a fanfiction about the Green Goblin from Amazing Spider-Man 2 and Enchantress from Suicide Squad set in space? Neither have I, but I imagine that their dialogue would sound a lot like the dialogue in this movie. Every time I've seen these two on screen together, it makes for some of the worst acting I've seen in 2017. Besson wrote the script, but he does nothing interesting with the material. It's just a bland, predictable shuffle from beginning to end without taking any risk. The development of Clive Owen's character felt very rushed. Like he's given a reason to do one thing, but then he tries to follow that up with a new motivation. He's also the bad guy of this movie, in case you couldn't tell. Even though this movie is only 137 minutes, it feels a lot longer than that. I felt as if they were purposely trying to drag out the runtime for as long as possible. And the boring action sequences didn't really help either. It was just lasers and fist fights. Yay. This movie was a lot of flash, but no bang. It gave you a show, but didn't fill it with substance. They should have retitled this movie Valerian and the Movie of a Thousand Disappointments, because that's how I felt walking out of the theater. It's a movie that, when considering the context, should have been a success. Luc Besson loved the comics growing up and always wanted to see them in movie format, but given the amount of special effects that would have to go into it, he figured that it would be impossible. But then Avatar came out and it showed that there was no such thing. He finally had the chance to make a movie that he had wanted to make for 20 years, but somehow it wasn't that good. I walked into this movie with the same mentality as Mad Max Fury Road. No expectations, but ready to be surprised. However, Mad Max impressed me with its simplistic use of story, strong acting, memorable lines, and awesome set pieces. Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets gave me annoying dialogue, forgettable characters, awful chemistry, and a predictable, boring plot. This was one movie I wish I didn't have to pay money to see. And I've seen Return of Xander Cage. Because with Xander Cage, it was exactly what I expected it to be. With Valerian, I wanted it to be something different. It's funny how people keep comparing it to Star Wars or Star Trek when this movie, in its own right, is unique. Do yourself a favor, though, and skip it.
Where's the bloody Air Force?
This takes place during the Battle of Dunkirk, in which 400,000 soldiers were evacuated as the Germans made their advance. This story is told through three perspectives: two pilots of the British Air Force, a group of soldiers on the beach, and a man and his son sailing across the channel to help with the evacuation. I love Christopher Nolan movies. Simple as that. He always tells cleverly woven stories that don't usually follow the traditional format of storytelling, usually putting the chronology of events out of order so the audience will have to figure out how it will all connect. This movie takes an interesting spin as the Battle of Dunkirk itself is center stage of this movie. As I mentioned before, Nolan's tradition of non-linear storytelling is a trademark of his craft. He likes to take viewers on an adventure by laying everything out on the table and mixing up the order of the plot. We see one event happen, then we see that event again, but from a different perspective. And that makes you feel as if you're right in the thick of it and witnessing everything firsthand. Once again, Hans Zimmer proves why he's a master at making music. Throughout each piece, you can sort of hear the ticking of a clock, giving that sense of panic and running out of time. You always feel on edge because the music is playing with your brain and giving off that sense of tension. There wasn't a single bad performance throughout this entire movie. Mark Rylance plays the father of these two sons and is going off across the channel because he knows it's the right thing to do. Cillian Murphy, on the other hand, wants him to turn around and go back to England. And you can see on his face why. He's seen some traumatizing stuff. If I watched everybody on my ship die and was left adrift at sea as the lone survivor, I wouldn't be too keen on going back to the enemy either. What really blew me away was Harry Styles. This marks his first film role and he nails every scene he's in. Probably the best part is that when he was cast in the movie, Christopher Nolan didn't know that Harry Styles was a member of One Direction. He didn't even know he was famous. That's what I like about Christopher Nolan. He casts people in this movie because he thinks they're good actors rather than because they're famous. Now what makes this movie unique is that it was more of a story of the people at Dunkirk rather than the battle itself. When there were fight scenes, it wasn't about how much blood and gore could be spilled, but rather how this affected the evacuation and the people surrounding it. This isn't really as phenomenal as Christopher Nolan's previous works. It never really stuck to me the same way Inception or The Dark Knight did. It's better than Interstellar, I'll give it that. I just didn't connect to it as much as I wanted to. Maybe it was because of the story that was presented, or maybe it was because I expected it to fall into the tropes that most war movies have. All in all, Dunkirk is a fantastic movie. It had outstanding performances, a haunting soundtrack, amazing cinematography, and Nolan's style of storytelling was all over the place. It's one of the best films of the year, even if it doesn't have the overly awesome appeal that comes with a Christopher Nolan film. I want to love this movie more, and I think I will after multiple viewings at the theater or on Blu-ray. After 4 years and just as many movies, the DCEU gives us their big epic team-up that fans have been clamoring for since Dawn of Justice. The franchise has had a bit of a rough start. Man of Steel wasn't exactly critically acclaimed, and Batman v Superman were critically slaughtered. But with the success of Wonder Woman and its surprising amount of Oscar buzz, you'd think that some of that magic would have transferred over to Justice League. But that doesn't seem to be the case, as the film has earned a meager 41% on their infamous critics' consensus site, and it failed to crack $100 million at the box office. Despite all that, fans loved the movie and are more confident in the future of the DCEU. The road to where we are now in Justice League has been odd, rocky, and surprisingly quick. With Avengers, they took 4 years to get there with solo movies before giving us the big payoff. Now, that's about the same amount of time between Man of Steel and Justice League, and about just as many movies, but they didn't really get serious about building the cinematic universe until they were developing Batman v Superman, and this was back when it had a scheduled release date in 2015. But now, they're pumping out the cinematic universe quota of 2 movies per year. And in that time span, we've had 2 hated movies, 1 beloved movie, and 1 movie that's... depends on who you ask. With such an uneven foundation for a cinematic universe, Justice League was meant to be the final building block in the baseline, in the phase 1 of the DCEU. And while this movie may not be the epic payoff most fans were looking forward to, it does a good job trying. There are 2 things the DCEU has gotten right: Batfleck and Wonder Gal. Get it? Cause Gal is a term for girl or woman and her first name is Gal, so... These 2 have well established themselves as the backbone of the universe, and it's Bruce and Diana who go around the world searching for Aquaman, Cyborg, and the Flash to form the League. I know there are some Grant Gustin purists out there, but guess what? You can like 2 different actors playing the same character. Okay? The point is, Jason Momoa, Ray Fisher, and Ezra Miller convinced me that they can pull off these roles. And I can confidently say, yes, I would like to see them get their own standalone movies, please. You have Cyborg, who's basically been brought back from the dead and is still trying to figure out who or what he is. You have Aquaman, who's resilient to fight because of something that went down between the Atlanteans and the Amazons. And we briefly touch on the Flash's origin by having him visit his father in prison. Warner Brothers understands that a lot of people watch the Flash show on the CW, so they pretty much skipped over the origin stuff and have this Flash pretty set in his ways. The Flash that you will see in Justice League, you will see throughout all the movies of the DCEU that have the Flash. And like all young superheroes, he has a lot to learn. One complaint that I think Warner Brothers went overboard with dealing from Batman v Superman is that it was too dark. I mean, that's how we got Suicide Squad. They tackled this the same way they did Wonder Woman. A healthy balance of drama and humor, but no saturation of either. You hear that, Marvel? Not every superhero movie has to be a comedy. I feel like that's the 10th time I've said that over the past few reviews. With every big team-up movie, you have to have some infighting, some friction within the group. That friction comes between Arthur Curry and Diana Prince versus Bruce Wayne. Bruce wants to bring back Superman using the Mother Box, but Arthur Curry and Diana Prince, knowing that Steppenwolf is after the Mother Boxes, and that if Bruce Wayne was to use them, not only will activating the Mother Box potentially draw Steppenwolf to them, but it may not even work in bringing back Superman. But Bruce, he insists on it. Ever since Superman's death at the hands of Doomsday in Batman v Superman, hope has sort of gone down the toilet. Bruce Wayne feels as if that blood is on his hands and that if he can bring back Superman, that will fulfill his quest for redemption. It's moments like those, along with the third act where the team works together to take down Steppenwolf, that make the price of admission totally worth it. The movie had a bit of an editing issue. You'd have this scene play out, then it just cuts to another moment and you're like, guess we're here now. It wasn't like there were scenes missing, it just felt like an awkward place to cut it. At a runtime of 2 hours, the movie didn't make time to slow down or drag. However, that had an effect on the story as it felt a bit rushed. I think the runtime of Batman v Superman was another complaint that Warner Brothers tried too hard to fix. In fact, that's the problem with the DCEU. Warner Brothers tries too hard to fix it. If the campfire is just a little bit too high, they'll pour buckets of water over it. On one hand, you prevented a forest fire from breaking out, but on the other hand, you've reduced your fire to a tiny flame. I just hope they lay off and calm down as they continue building their extended universe. I don't even want to know about any of the potential behind-the-scenes drama that's going on with Aquaman. Now don't be fooled. Even though this is a Zack Snyder movie, it lacked the Zack Snyder tone. I know some people aren't exactly fans of him, but personally, I think he definitely has an eye for cinematography and visuals. He left the project in May due to a family crisis, so Joss Whedon was brought on board to write additional scenes, do reshoots, and oversee post-production. Now on the surface, that doesn't sound like a terrible idea. Who better to work on a superhero team-up movie than somebody who worked on 2 of them? Why not boost box office numbers by getting the writer and director of the MCU's highest-grossing films? The problem is, Joss Whedon doesn't really have a style the same way Zack Snyder does. Zack likes to use slow motion, and he has a certain color scheme. Joss Whedon, on the other hand, he just does whatever. As much as I liked Age of Ultron, the cinematography was fairly generic. Not to mention, every Marvel movie has pretty much had the same color palette. Although now that I think about it, DC is starting to have that issue too. The opening credits may say directed by Zack Snyder, but everything that follows will have you convinced that this is a Joss Whedon movie. I think a more appropriate credit would have been directed by Joss Whedon after he saw Batman v Superman. And also, aside from Everybody Knows at the beginning and Come Together at the end credits, the soundtrack is pretty forgettable. Justice League is nowhere near the epic spectacle a lot of people were hoping, but in this case, it doesn't have to be. Much like the Avengers, this is about a mismatched group of heroes coming together to fight off an evil to save the planet. There will be plenty of opportunities for bigger and better Justice League movies, and when we'll see them is just a matter of time. Although given the reaction to the box office numbers, I think it's high time Warner Brothers got themselves a Kevin Feige type figurehead. We know this universe has a future, but there's no good in pursuing it if there's nobody there to map it all out. The DC is doing okay for now. Not terrific, but it definitely needs to step up. With its universe building, its character development, its good acting, and its healthy balance of drama and comedy, we know that DCEU has a bright future ahead. When all is said and done, Justice League deserves to be viewed multiple times, whether it's at the theater or on Blu-ray.
Following up on the most anticipated sequel of all time, Star Wars The Last Jedi follows Rey as she tries to get a reluctant Luke out of hiding while the Resistance is trying to outrun a First Order fleet. Time is not on anybody's side, as General Hux and Kylo Ren are more than ready to finish off the Resistance once and for all. This was written and directed by Rian Johnson, whose last film, Looper, is considered one of the best sci-fi movies ever made. With that in mind, you'd think that this Star Wars movie would be a shoo-in for acclaim. The critics liked it, but the fans, not so much. For the first time since Attack of the Clones, the audience score for a Star Wars movie has been rotten. Some fans hate it so much that there's petitions to have The Last Jedi removed from the Star Wars canon and to have the Rotten Tomatoes site shut down. I can sort of understand where they're coming from with the Rotten Tomatoes thing because it has a system that desperately needs revamping. And while I do think Rotten Tomatoes is unreliable, I do often give it the benefit of the doubt. As for the movie, it's not as good as the fans say it is, but it's nowhere near the tangled mess some fans claim it to be. The movie wastes no time getting into the story as the action starts right away. Minus the opening crawl, the first 15 minutes are one big space battle. We found out that the Resistance is on the run ever since they blew up not Death Star 3, and now they're evacuating their own base. The First Order is chasing them, and the Resistance fleet only have so much fuel before their shields go down and they're blasted into oblivion. That really set the tone of the movie because for the first time in ages, we have a Star Wars movie that has a real sense of despair. The fact that Luke isn't exactly jumping at the chance to leave the island doesn't help either. What drove this movie forward was the character development, both old and new. Poe Dameron gets a lot more time in the spotlight, which is a huge step up from The Force Awakens. Honestly, what did he do in that movie? He got captured, faked his own death, and then showed up in the third act just in time to blow up Starkiller Base. In this one, he's front and center, playing by his own rules and butting heads with General Leia Organa as they try to figure out how to save the Resistance. Finn also gets plenty of screen time, which is a relief because I thought he was going to spend the first 2/3 of that movie in that comatose state. He bonds with crew member Rose, and they go on a little side quest that, although it's a bit of a waste of time, you learn more about their characters. They're selfless, they care for people, they want justice to be brought back to the galaxy. It's little niches of character development like that that make some of the filler moments all the worthwhile. The Force has always had a sense of mystery to it, and The Last Jedi dives into that mythos without overcomplicating things. There are moments of confusion as to what a Force user can or cannot do. For example, someone could project themselves to appear before someone without actually being there as long as they had some sort of connection to that person. I could sit here and talk about what a Force user can or cannot do, but that would take the whole video. Just bear in mind there will be moments where you'll be thinking,
That's not how the Force works.
another thing this movie teaches you about this galaxy is that the complexity of the Jedi and Sith aren't as black and white as you think. The relationship between Rey and Kylo Ren is sort of an analogy for the light and the dark side. Rey has a little bit too much pent-up anger from all those years of being abandoned on Jakku to be a true Jedi, and Kylo Ren isn't exactly the evil Sith Lord he's aspiring to be. Neither one of them is a prime example of a Jedi or a Sith, as they both carry elements from either side. There is a very return-to-roots way of storytelling. George Lucas based Star Wars off the formats of samurai movies, war films, and westerns. Rian Johnson brings aspects of those genres back into the franchise along with his own understanding of science fiction. There's a subplot where Finn and Rose go to a casino resort on a planet called Canto Bight, and it is probably the most filler I've seen in a movie since Valerian and the City of 1,000 Planets. This section could have been easily trimmed down as it did very little other than pan out the runtime. We do get an introduction to Benicio del Toro's character, but he was very replaceable. You could have swapped him with anybody and nobody would have noticed. If they want us to have some sort of emotional connection with him before the end of episode 9, then J.J. Abrams and Chris Terrio have their work cut out for them. The main plot was stuck in one place for the majority of the movie. Think Murder on the Orient Express, except not as interesting. It tries to make up for its lack of location diversity by jumping from place to place near the final act, but by that point, the damage is already done. We've been stuck on the ship for basically the entire movie, and now we're just waiting for this thing to wrap up. Finally, and I hate to hold this against them, but Captain Phasma was once again criminally underused. At this point, she's become the Boba Fett of the sequel trilogy, hopefully without her being axed off into a Sarlacc pit in the next movie. She shows up for one fight scene, and then that's it. I don't know how they managed to do it, but she somehow got even less screen time than she did in The Force Awakens. It's like they said, alright, we have this one scene and action. Good, you're done. You can put your costume back on the shelf and we'll call you again when we need you for episode 9. Star Wars The Last Jedi is a mixed bag in every sense of the word. There's moments you'll love, and there's moments you'll hate. It gives more questions than answers, but it also provides insight. The action and effects were mind-blowing as ever, the characters were a bit more developed, there was a real sense of danger, and the Force was given a bit more depth. Then on the other side of the coin, you have a panned-out story, 2 underused characters that are meant to carry a lot of weight, and a static backdrop. It's not a perfect movie, it's not even the best Star Wars movie, but since Disney is cranking out these movies on a yearly basis with even more on the way, I think we can cut them some slack. The only reason this movie has any controversy is because of fans who didn't like it and have this mentality that says, oh, if I didn't like it, nobody should. So to those people I say, let the fans who enjoyed The Last Jedi enjoy it, myself included. Even though I didn't like it as much as Force Awakens or Rogue One, I liked it for what it was. And I will be more than happy to give Star Wars The Last Jedi multiple viewings, whether it's at the theater or on Blu-ray.